very different kind of Timesuck topic today. Ward motherfucking Hall. Who is he? If you're new to the show, this topic could not be less representative of the kind of topic we typically cover here. He is not a known historical figure. He is not a cult leader, not the center of a conspiracy, not a serial killer. I'm 99.9% sure he did lead a great life, and I think we can all learn from his example. He is my grandfather, my mom's dad. He was a great man whose story I'm proud to share, and he passed away this past December, early in the morning of December 23rd, with my mom and his wife Betty by his side after getting up to use the restroom. He sat down, closed his eyes, and that was it. My mom said it was like a light switch just turned off. He was 88. Shortly after his passing, our Space Lizard Patreon supporters, who vote on 2 topics each and every month here at Timesuck, they voted his name up the topic board to the top spot. I was shocked. Now he is part of the catalog. I'm glad they did. I've mentioned his advice in the past on the show, and they wanted to hear more, wanted to know who he was. So get ready for a little hero worship, meat sacks. Hail Nimrod and hail Papa Ward. Was my Grandpa Ward a perfect man? Undeserving of any criticism? No, none of us are. He can be jealous. He can be rude. He can be grumpy, especially when the slots were kicking his ass at the tribal casino. He can be a little controlling, a little snippy from time to time with my Grandma Betty. But I never saw them fight, even though they were married for over 60 years. Papa Ward had his faults, but they were heavily outweighed by his good deeds, qualities, his character. Was Papa Ward a better man than most? Yeah, sure as shit was. And I don't say that just because I'm blood. I have plenty of other family members who I also love, who I would not give the same glowing review. He was, as the cliche goes, a good man, a really good man, the kind the world could always use more of. He was a good dad, a good granddad, a good husband, neighbor, friend, veteran. Who was Ward Hall? What made him great? That's what I hope to lay out here today. I'm going to pepper in lots of little stories about the man he was this week, who he was, how he treated others, and also, because this is still Timesuck, I'm going to provide some historical and geo-targeted context for his life. Let's learn about Idaho as well today, the state no one ever really cares about, the state that is actually more than potatoes and racist and anti-government paranoid people. Today on this very personal, glad I got to spend some time reflecting on one of the most important and influential people in my life edition of Timesuck.
This is Michael McDonald, and you're listening to Timesuck.
You're listening to Timesuck.
Happy Monday, meat sacks. Step inside the circle, you curious bastards, and grab some hands. Welcome to the Cult of the Curious. I'm feeling extra excited for the future of the cult this week. Focusing on my grandfather has been healing for me. It's recentered me. Reminded me of, why I'm here. What we're doing here is special. Not that I forgot. I was just behind the scenes, letting maybe the minority, little small slice of trolls and negative Nancys out there get to me more than they should. Instead of focusing on all the positivity, my grandpa would consider that kind of thought weak-minded, I believe. So I'm knocking that shit off. Hail Nimrod, hail Lucifina, praise Bojangles, glory be to Triple M, recording in the Suck Dungeon out of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The city where Papa Ward took his beautiful bride, my Grandma Betty, on a honeymoon back in 1957. And now I'm recording an episode down the street from where they undoubtedly had a lot of honeymoon sex. You know they did. Just 2 horny kids in love. Just knocking it out. And yes, I'm talking about my grandparents. It's only weird. It's only weird if you make it weird. Still not quite ready to promote any stand-up tour dates, but those are coming. I feel like it's getting close, right? The things are opening up. It's exciting. What is happening pretty soon is a real live Scared to Death show. April 22nd, 6 p.m. Pacific time at looped.com, a Thursday night, recording from the Scared to Death studio. Going to be interactive. Looped has some really cool features. I'll have more details soon. Just planting the seed now. Just set your calendars now. Turn all the lights off that night. Enjoy some horror with Lindsay and I. Joe and Logan going to be working production. The script keeper, Zach, also might be helping produce that show. So set the date. Very cool Timesuck striper inspired to Hell with the Devil t-shirt in the store at badmagicmerch.com right now. Think about how much fun it would be to have that song stuck in your head all day long because you're wearing a To Hell with the Devil t-shirt. To hell with the devil. Oh, nice. All kinds of fun stuff here at badmagicmerch.com. When you're not checking in on the store, I hope you're playing the Timesuck trivia game on the app. A reminder that the March Bad Magic Productions charity is the USC Showa Foundation, giving them $12,500. Thanks for helping us make a donation to that important charity. sfi.usc.edu. Link in the episode description if you want to learn more, want to donate more. And you can check out the new charity page on the Timesuck app and learn about all kinds of charities. It lists out all the charities we've donated to with a link to each charity, a little description of who they are. So that's exciting. More excitement coming on the app soon. The Order of the Suck tab should now be live. So I say soon for me, recording in, when I'm recording, when this episode comes out, should be right now, present tense. So make sure and update your app. Look for that Order of the Suck tab. That is the Suck as an S, little acronym, Society of the Understanding of Critical Knowledge, ex quo uberibus. Head on over to badmagicmerch.com to the store there starting March 15th. That's the day this episode comes out. Sign up to receive one of our Timesuck Freemason type stickers. They'll cost $5 to cover shipping and handling. You can put it up in your business, in a prominently displayed place to let fellow meat sacks know to come support that business. Each business eligible to buy one sticker for their business. If you have multiple locations, just email us, bojangles@timesuckpodcast.com. We'll sort it out. Once you receive your sticker or stickers, stick them in a visible location. Then email a picture of where you placed your sticker to bojangles, at timesuckpodcast.com with Order of the Suck as the subject. All of these notes, too, in the Timesuck app. If you're like, wait, what did he say? The easiest way, go to the Timesuck app, and you can download the show notes for any episode, including this one, and be like, oh, okay, here's all the links. Here's exactly the language. You include the name of your business, physical address, phone number, short description of what your business offers in the email, and then other suckers will be able to find your business in the cool little map feature of this new function of the app. We're very excited about it. Be sure and update your app on or after, again, the day this comes out, the 15th. Really excited to support small suck businesses right now. Okay, enough announcements. Time for me to suck my grandfather. So why did I and do I look up to my grandpa, my mom's dad? One of the things that made him great to me was his devotion to family. One Christmas several years ago, maybe 2015, 2016, like so many other Christmases, I was hanging out in the living room of my Papa Ward and Grandma Betty's house in Riggins, Idaho, not far from the high school that I graduated from, the high school my mom graduated from, and the one that my Grandma Betty also graduated from. I spent so many Christmas Eves, that little house, so many days overall there. I once laid on my back as a newborn baby on that living room floor, listened to the ticking of the same clocks that are still on the walls, still ticking today, played on that floor as a toddler with my great-grandparents, and now my kids have done the same with theirs. My great-great-grandfather, Frank Berman, the old Swede, once lived on that property in the bunkhouse out back that he helped build. He also helped build the 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom until about 20 years ago when a second bathroom was added main house with his son, my great-grandfather John, not long after they immigrated to America from Sweden. Just, hangy bangy, oofta, oofta. My family is exactly where my joking about the Swedish language comes from. Great-grandpa John and his wife, my great-grandma Stell, a dirty Norwegian. He loved to tease for being Norwegian. He picked up in Minnesota on the way to Idaho, raised their kids there, my grandma Betty and her sister Ruth. My grandma Betty still lives in her parents' old home now, the one her grandpa helped build. She moved away for part of her younger life, but then moved back to help her mom in her final years. I say moved away. She moved half a mile across town. How interesting and rare is that she's 81 years old. She makes sure the lawn is taken care of, the same lawn she once played on as a kid, or like 70 years ago. The lawn my mother and aunt, played on when they were kids. The lawn where I played, or my children have played, still play. I've only ever felt like my heart was really connected to one piece of actual land, one piece of property, and it's that one. I have no parental home equivalent. Like, we moved around quite a bit when I was a kid. Altogether, I added it up. I lived in 10 different places before I graduated high school, went to 3 different grade schools in 2 states, 5 different houses in Riggins, 1 outside of town in nearby Pinehurst, little community, 3 different apartments over a few years in Anchorage, Alaska, and an apartment for 2 years in Las Vegas. Then in college, I spent a year in each of 2 different dorms, then in 4 different houses, and then after college, lived in an additional 7 apartments and houses. So I've called 23 different places my home. And in 2 decades of stand-up, I've spent so many nights away from wherever I've called home in hotels across the world. And throughout all of that, the Riggins house, that one property, always there for me. A place for me to return to and recenter, is built around 1950, my grandma thinks, by my great-grandpa and great-great-grandpa. 6 generations of my family have broken bread on tables under that roof. 6 generations have slept in beds there, have eaten walnuts fallen off the old black walnut tree out back, I've played, a lot of kids have played my family by the old ditch that runs through the property and through town. A lot of people laughed, cried, built lives, lived lives there. And anyway, that one Christmas several years ago, I was there with my wife, Lindsay, Kyler, Monroe, and my only sibling. My sister Donna was there with her 2 kids, Emerson and Ellie Bird, and her husband, Jared, my mom, Charlene, my stepdad, Tim, my aunt Stell, her husband, Mike, my grandma, Betty, her sister, Ruth, my papa, Ward, numerous other cousins and uncles, great uncles, etc. have been in and out of there over the holidays. So many memories. And this one Christmas, as wrapping paper lay scattered all over the floor, as I watched Kyler, Monroe, and their cousins play with new toys on the floor, as I listened to my grandma Betty joke and laugh with her daughters, my mom and Aunt Stell, and with Lindsay and Donna, my grandpa sat in his recliner in the corner, watching over everyone and smiling like he often did. He sat sipping his coffee. Dude loved coffee. Sipped coffee all day long for as long as I knew him. Sipped and sat like he'd done in that chair for over 20 years, so many times, where my great-grandfather had once sat before him and sipped coffee and watched everybody for additional decades. And I sat in the front of the wood stove my great-grandma used to constantly toss more firewood into and somehow still be cold, while everyone else felt like they were going to pass out from like a heat stroke. And I'm sitting there, my pop ward gets up, walks over to me, and he says, "Danny, this is what life is all about. Family. Watching everybody grow up." He truly loved his family. I think he loved family in a way many people never can, like in a way they can't appreciate, because he didn't have someone like himself in his life when he was a kid, like not even close. I don't remember ever meeting any of his family outside of, a few brothers who came to the house the night before the funeral. He never spoke about them. He only talked to me about them if I asked him. He had a terrible father. He referred to his father not by name, but as the old man. And the old man was, according to Papa Ward, the few times I was able to get this out of him, an abusive drunk he just would rather not talk about. And his mom, he didn't seem to have much love for her either. She left him when he was young, 4, and he never really spent any time with her after that during his childhood. She never seemed to make much of an effort to have a relationship with him. Growing up outside of some of his siblings, he had really no one to lean on, no safety net to ever fall back on. And then he grew up, and instead of being bitter about all that, instead of complaining about how life wasn't fair and about the bad hand he'd been dealt, about how he'd been given a raw deal, etc., he worked his ass off. He seemed especially motivated to make sure he wasn't anything like his father. He just built himself a very different life than the one he had as a kid. He knew what it felt like to have parents you couldn't count on, who didn't seem to care for you, who didn't protect you, so he made sure to be the exact opposite of that for his family, and he did so well in that regard. He and my grandma took my mom and I, my sister, into their home after my parents' divorce, when my mom couldn't afford to live on her own, couldn't afford to raise 2 kids on her own, and we never felt unwanted, never felt like a burden. The opposite, actually. He helped raise me and my sister. He never complained about it. He seemed to love it. I ate more meals at their house growing up than I did at either my mom's or my dad's houses. So many meals with Papa Ward. Digging up potatoes from his garden out back to have Grandma cook them up. Classic Idaho. Of course I was digging up potatoes. Such a stereotype. Picking some corn from his garden or some tomatoes. Never saw a guy like tomatoes more than Papa Ward. Dude ate them like apples. Also, sometimes we eat onions like apples, which still disturbs me. We just bite into an onion like a fucking madman. Never ate the liver. He kept always trying to push on my plate. Dude loved liver. No one loved to tell you what you needed to eat. No one tried to put more food on your plate than Papa Ward. And he gave us a home, a great home. He did the same for his only other child and her children, my aunt. After her divorce, she also moved back in with him and my grandma. He did whatever he needed to do to take care of his little tribe. He always put family first, even ahead of his primary retirement entertainment of slot machines. Man, he loved a hot slot. Papa Ward never made a lot of money in any given year, but he and my grandma were so good with the money they did make. The classic, it's not what you earn, it's what you save. They didn't waste it, never gambled more money than they were okay with losing. They never made much, but they had such great retirements. They saved, they planned. He knew what it was like to live without. He was born during the Great Depression, and from what I've learned, was a kid from one of the poorest families of a really impoverished area of Idaho. He knew what it was like to have not, so he taught himself to be very good with the money he did have once he had it. The first priority he had with money was not to go get a fancy car, a new truck, or fancy clothes, or a bigger, nicer house, or to go on luxurious vacations. He didn't give a fuck about keeping up with the Joneses. The Joneses could run up their credit cards all day long. Papa Ward would drive a beater until he could buy a new car or truck with nothing but cash. His first priority was always to make sure everyone was taken care of. He was the rock for everyone to lean on. I find so much nobility in that, right? So much altruism. You don't see a lot of that in life. Very inspiring. I hope you enjoyed the story of his life today as best I can tell it. Going to share some of the advice he gave and a lot of funny family tales and some poignant memories I have to create the best picture of who he was. Going to lay out a timeline of his life and mix in some Idaho history with it. Need to lay out some context of where he lived first. Need to throw down some hogfolk, dogfolk, Central Idaho history. Not too much, though. Not too much. I doubt there are a ton of listeners who just can't get enough of Central Idaho history, who just think like, man, I sure hope Cummins lays out a ton of Central Idaho. I hope most of the episode is Central Idaho history. If there's one thing I can't get enough of, it's learning about Idaho County. Fuck yeah, bro. Now, I'm going to make it all as entertaining as I can. Let's hop on in, learn about Pop Ward, also about Idaho. I learned so much. I wish I would have learned years ago. I'm embarrassed I didn't. On today's Timesuck timeline.
Strap on those boots, soldier. We're marching down a Timesuck timeline.
August 13th, 1932. Ward Dale Hall is born near Lake Cascade in central Idaho, except it wasn't a lake at that time. He was just born in an area where a lake would be, in the no longer existent little community of Arling, Idaho. He's born with a comb over, wearing suspenders and blue jeans that wouldn't stay on his butt without him. At least that's how I imagine it. That's how I saw him for most of my life. He's probably born with a trucker hat. He's born on the homestead. His grandfather, Samuel Hall, who was born in Nashville, Tennessee on August 28th, 1851, had traveled west to lay claim to. Before Tennessee, the Halls go back to Virginia and North Carolina. My oldest known American-born relative on that side being Elizabeth Amanda Hall, born in Stony Fork, North Carolina, 1739. Before North Carolina, I think they came over from England, but I'm not 100% positive. Ancestry.com, the family tree there, not currently tracked back prior to the birth of Elizabeth Amanda, which is a great name, by the way. I love both those names, and I really like them put together. I'm just going to say, I bet my fourth great-grand aunt was a looker. Hail, Lucifina. Samuel Hall got his homestead land title for 160 acres near and now partially under Cascade Lake in 1894. And since you generally had to homestead for a good 5 years before you got your land deed, guessing Samuel, who would be my great-great-grandfather, started farming the land where Papa Ward was born sometime around 1889. He would have had to have traveled by wagon train, on horseback for at least part of the journey, since no railroad reached anywhere near that area of Idaho at that time. Probably did take the railroad to get to from Tennessee over into southern Idaho. Early central Idaho roots, at least for a white man. And how crazy to hop on a train, head out west, to just join some wagon train, to claim, then try and tame 160 acres of untamed land with the tools, that today you can only find in a museum or on somebody's property as decoration. How weird in the time we live in to think about traveling anywhere where you can't access Wi-Fi or drive through a Starbucks or head to an urgent care clinic or own or access a car or own or potentially buy a nice pair of comfortable hiking shoes, air conditioning, heater, fast food, or in little tiny Arling, Idaho, you probably, couldn't even get a restaurant. If there was a restaurant, there was no more than one. My grandma doesn't even think they had a single restaurant. Samuel, in all likelihood, would have had to build his own place to live, build his own barn. He would have had to clear the ground of pine trees, maybe a lot of pine trees. He would have had to use an axe or a cross-cut saw, also called a misery whip, to fall that timber. The term misery whip comes from the difficulty and frustration of using a saw that was unwieldy and didn't hold a sharp edge very well. Cutting down tree after tree with an unwieldy, fucking dull saw made you miserable. Misery whips came in a variety of sizes depending on the tree that was cut down. The saws ranged from the one-man saw, which could be as short as 3 feet, to the two-man saw, which could be as long as 16 feet. Those guys just pulling it back and forth. Felling saws were flexible, relatively light saws, these lumberjacks would use to cut down these trees. Sounds terrible. And then you had to get rid of the stump. Here is how one article on homesteading in the 19th century laid out a way of getting rid of stumps. It says, after a tree was felled, branches were cut off and the trunk rolled aside. The stump might have been left in the ground for a few years to let it deteriorate a bit. Eventually, the stump had to be grubbed. Just grubbing stumps. A grub axe, 4 to 8 inches wide, flat on one side, was used to dig around stumps, cut off small roots. A pickaxe was used to cut off larger roots. A double bit or pickaxe had 2 sides. It was used to break hardened or rocky soils, to chop out roots while loosening the soil, and to remove or break rocks. And then blacksmiths made the axes and the tools, all these tools they used. So a real big tree with a lot of big, healthy roots, that was an all-day job. Imagine clearing 160 acres of stumps, just grubbing. When I read about stuff like this, I often think about how much tougher folk had to be to survive in times like these compared to now. I also think about web trolls randomly and whiny outrage police types. You know, people always bitching about how this or that isn't fair. Life isn't fair. I wonder how much less they would bitch if they had to do some fucking grubbing, some stumping, hard manual labor. I feel like it could calm down a lot of keyboard warriors, a lot of Debbie Downers. Fucking come to their senses real quick if they had to do some grubbing. Old Pappy Samuel would have likely had a pair of workhorses to pull the steel plow across the land, him walking behind it. What did he grow? I don't know for sure. Possibly potatoes, corn, wheat, probably a variety of crops on rotation, depending on what was selling that year. Whatever he sold, I know he didn't sell much. They didn't make a living off the farm. He never even built a proper cabin on the homestead. Papa Ward's family tree, not many branches were anything other than extreme rural poverty. He homesteaded largely, I imagine, because he didn't have enough money to buy anything back in Tennessee. And what a different kind of life. Hard work for not much money. I know the old Hall farm had milk cows. They could have had fresh milk. They did when Papa Ward was young. Churn butter, maybe make some cheese even. They had chickens. They hunted deer, caught extra fish for food. They ate what they grew. And they did okay in that respect. You know, they were very poor, but no family stories about anyone starving that I'm aware of. They lived off the land, and they sure picked some pretty cold, snow-laden land to live off of. The average low temperature for the area was just 10 degrees Fahrenheit in January, with an average high of 36. December, about the same. The average low is either below freezing or at freezing from October all the way through May. And then there was the snow. Cascade, the Long Valley there, averages 102 inches of snow per year. That's in case you're bad with inches. That's a fucking lot. That's over 8 feet a season. Much more in all the surrounding mountains. Not all at one time, of course, but still a lot over a winter. The average snowfall for the U.S., 28 inches. Coeur d'Alene here averages, we get a lot of snow compared to most places, averages about 70 inches. You know, it was an extra 32 inches in the Long Valley there. Papa Ward talked about having to walk to school through the snow. When I was a kid, I thought he was just exaggerating because we didn't get a lot of snow in Riggins. He was not kidding. He had to walk through deep snow. The only source of heat they had growing up was a wood stove. No hand warmers, no modern insulated fancy-ass gloves you could buy at REI or some ski shop. Now, maybe a pair of some old leather work gloves that you better not lose because you just can't Amazon a new pair to yourself in 48 hours or less if you do lose them. Man, gotta have it easy compared to my grandpa or compared to my old Pappy Samuel. Holy shit. I typed up these notes on a MacBook Pro. I listened to some Chubby Checker radio on Spotify through a nice Bose speaker here in the Suck Dungeon. Papa Ward loves some Chubby Checker. Loves some Fast Domino. I sat in a climate-controlled studio, grabbed a hot coffee from a coffee stand down the street, tons of delicious lunch options within 5 minutes of the Suck Dungeon, still sleeping on a sweet Lisa mattress with all its fucking mattress technology, watching shows on Netflix, bouncing from device to device seamlessly to do so, watch them on a big-ass flat-screen TV that costs less than a TV half the size and 10 times the weight cost a few years ago, and I still bitch about shit every day. Right? Wi-Fi takes more than 5 seconds to bring up a site, and I'm like, come on, load already, you piece of shit. Been having some Facebook problems, like I had to verify something, and I had to wait on the email. Took longer than I thought, and I immediately was like, fuck Facebook, fucking hate it. All worked up. Got it so easy compared to these guys back then. I'm dumb enough to look online and read some one-star reviews of myself from time to time, and immediately I'm like, oh, fuck you, asshole, you have no idea how hard I work on this. If Pappy Samuel would have heard me complaining about any of this stuff, he'd probably whip my ass, or at least would have wanted to. Thinking about all this, always a good reminder to try and be mentally stronger. To try not to sweat the small stuff. Right? Appreciate how good we have it in so many ways. Pappy Ward's grandfather Samuel, an early central Idaho settler. The area around the no longer there Arlene community and the still around Cascade, 70 miles south of where I grew up in Riggins, Idaho, down Highway 95, then Highway 55. It wasn't first settled whitey-wise until some point in the early 1860s by a man named John Welsh, a man more commonly known in local lore as Packer John. Packer John! He was the first... Packer Johnny! Packer John was the first man to establish a travel route between Lewiston, up north in Idaho, down to Boise, the Boise Basin, down south, at that time celebrated as West Bannock, the richest mining region in southern Idaho. Packer John packed a lot of shit, a lot of miles. Went through a lot of, untamed wilderness. Idaho, and I didn't know this until digging into my family tree this week, was one of the last areas in the lower 48 states to be explored by people of European descent. And central Idaho was the last area of Idaho to be settled. Basically, in the lower 48, the area where I grew up was the very last area in the U.S. to be settled by people not native to this continent. The Lewis and Clark expedition did not enter present-day Idaho until August 12th, 1805. They were probably the first people of European descent to set foot in present-day Idaho. Not that long ago. Probably. British-Canadian explorer, surveyor, and fur trader David Thompson may have led an expedition into Idaho down from Canada in 1803, but fuck that guy. Did you know that David Thompson killed all 3 of his wives by throwing them off cliffs in either the Idaho or Canadian wilderness? If you know that, hit me up with the deets, because I don't know that. I'd never heard about David Thompson. I just wanted to shake up the story a bit, say something crazy. Random crazy, actually true David Thompson fact, nicknamed the Stargazer, dude traveled 56,000 miles back before cars. All across North America, mapping 1.9 million squares of land of North America. Considered by some, this British Canadian to be the greatest practical land geographer the world has produced. I didn't know who the hell he was until this week. So maybe he dipped into Idaho, maybe not. So 1803 or 1805 is when the first few white people dipped into the potato state. Fur traders started showing up in Idaho around 1808 or 1809, and they first showed up not very far from where I record these podcasts. The Kalispell House was a fur trading post about an hour north of the Suck Dungeon on Lake Pend Oreille, near the beautiful town of Sandpoint, built for the Northwest Company of Fur Traders in 1809. Some French-speaking traders working there began to use the French words Coeur d'Alene as a nickname for the Stichewumps people who traded at Kalispell House. In French, Coeur means heart, Alene means awl, a sharp-pointed tool used to pierce leather. In other words, they were known as sharp traders with hearts like the point of an awl. Within a few years, the Stichewumps people became known as the Coeur d'Alene tribe. And the large lake at the center of their homeland became Lake Coeur d'Alene. The lake, the Suck Dungeon I record out of, sits about a half mile from here, the shore does. The Kalispell House would be abandoned after just 2 years in 1811. By the 1820s, more fur traders, the British-owned Hudson's Bay Company, were established in southern Idaho, working that Snake River. In 1836, the first Christians to make Idaho their permanent home showed up. That year, Reverend Henry H. Spalding established a Protestant mission near Lapwai, where he printed the Northwest's first book, established Idaho's first school, developed its first irrigation system, and brought some taters. He grew the state's first potatoes. How about that? Idaho's first tater man. Wonder if he had any idea that Idaho would become the potato state, known mostly for potatoes. Poor guy never got to experience how tasty a French fry is. Never had a salty, waffle-cut bit of deliciousness, dipped in some sweet, tangy ketchup and then put in his pie hole. Reverend Spalding and his family joined with some fur traders, other missionaries, to be part of the very first wagon train to head west on America's Oregon Trail. So a little bit of yeah there. Lapwai, almost exactly 100 miles north of where Papa Ward spent most of his life in my hometown of Riggins, and 175 miles north of the Hall homestead Papa Ward's grandfather laid claim to. Reverend Spalding moved to Lapwai mostly to convert members of the Nez Perce tribe there to Christianity. The Catholics showed up not many years later. In 1850, Cataldo Mission, the oldest standing building in all of Idaho, was constructed just 27 miles east of the Suck Dungeon by members of the Coeur d'Alene tribe and early Catholic missionaries. Some Jesuits out of St. Louis who moved into the area just a few years earlier. I've been inside this building with Lindsay before. It's nice. It's not mind-blowing, but it's nice. There's no big stone and marble masterpiece. Some big cathedral you'd find back east. No elegant Spanish-tiled mission you'd find down in the southwest, but it's cool. Crazy that it's Idaho's oldest still standing building. Compared to, say, anywhere in Europe, most places in the U.S., it is not very old. Right? Like, go to London, you can find Roman ruins. You can see Westminster Abbey. I've been in there. Massive stone church built in 960. My brain doesn't even want to acknowledge how old it is. Remodeled in 1245. Pointed arches, ribbed vaulting, rose windows, flying buttresses, remodeled again in 1722. Has a delicately carved fan vaulted roof now with hanging pendants. It's awe-inspiring. The big Gothic behemoth. Kings buried underneath its floors. Nearly 100 statues of saints in niches around the walls. Come to Idaho, you can find one small wooden church from 1850 and with a floor it's pretty flat. It doesn't look like it's going to quite fall apart yet. It's it's more beat up somehow than Westminster Abbey. No one's coming to Idaho for architectural masterpieces. Those Jesuits would go on to found Gonzaga University about 60 miles west of Cataldo. west of that mission in Spokane, Washington, where I would go to college. They founded that in 1887. Go Zags! Men's team, still undefeated, headed into the NCAA tournament. Number 1 in the nation all season long, in case you hadn't heard. Pumped for March Madness this year. The Zags not making it to at least the Final Four. This year is truly going to be some fucking craziness. This is the best chance they've had to win it all, ever. Gonzaga was founded by Father Joseph Cataldo, same man the old mission is named after. In the 1850s, the Mormons showed up when a variety of Mormon settlers settled into southeast Idaho. Oh my heck, gosh dang, they got to some flipping homesteading down there. What the flip is up with all these stumps we got, grub, Ezekiel? On March 4th, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln, name rings a bell, vaguely. He signed an act to create Idaho Territory, with its territorial capital originally not being in Boise, but in Lewiston. It would change a few years later, but originally Lewiston. Lewiston, been there so many times, so many memories. The giant metropolis of roughly 30,000 people, home of the big potlatch paper mill, a.k.a. big-ass gag and stink factory. We spend about 15, 20 minutes having to get used to it when I travel to Lewiston. I've been to Lewiston so many times. I just drove down to Lewiston last Tuesday with Lindsay and the kids to have dinner with my mom and Grandma Betty at Zany's. Great little Lewiston, longtime restaurant. Lewiston, halfway between Coeur d'Alene and Riggins. It's where Papa Ward and Grandma Betty, or my mom, used to drive me to get school clothes and do Christmas shopping growing up. Hitting Kmart and Shopko. We would drive 2 hours to do some sweet-ass Kmart shopping. Neither store is there anymore. I got my first computer in Lewiston from another store that no longer exists. Best Electronics. I think they've been out of business for like fucking 30 years. Commodore 64. Fuck yeah, bro. Playing Skate or Die, some Airborne Ranger at Papa Ward and Grandma Betty's house with the Wilson boys, Kyler and Chance. And after watching the 1983 Matthew Broderick movie War Games, dreaming of being a hacker and somehow hacking into the bank in town, taking a penny a day from everyone's account and put it into the savings account Grandma Betty opened for me. I was going to be rich, no one's going to notice. Papa Ward and Grandma Betty, they let me turn the entire back room of their house into my mess around on the computer, practice the saxophone, which I'm sure was super fun for them to listen to in a small house, and flip through the encyclopedia, right? They let me just do whatever I want back there. They had a little small 3-bedroom house, 1 bath, and they let me have free reign over a good chunk of it. As long as Papa Ward had his recliner in the living room, got to watch the 5 o'clock Boise News on the TV and the Atlanta Braves games, whenever they were on TBS, he didn't care what you did with the rest of the house, as long as you weren't too fucking noisy. I was spoiled. I wasn't pulling stumps. I wasn't grubbing. Wasn't walking through the snow in old boots covered in newspaper to keep my feet from freezing like Grandpa Ward used to do because he didn't have proper boots. Back to Lewiston, bought a lot of G.I. Joes at that Kmart in Lewiston. Bought a lot of knockoff sneakers at that Shopko. Bought my first compact disc in some long-dead record shop in that old Lewiston Mall on the top of the hill. Dr. Dre's The Chronic. Fuck yeah, nothing but a G thing. I bet you didn't expect that one. Years earlier, I have a funny Papa Ward memory from that tiny Lewiston Mall. Back in the mid-'80s, I was there with Grandma Betty and Papa Ward. We were in JCPenney's, maybe Sears. That mall's so tiny. Its food court was in Orange Julius. Like, that's it. Literally just one place to get food. And they didn't even have much food. You could get a hot dog, or you could get Orange Julius, or maybe like 2 other flavors of Julius, and not much else. I had like 3 anchor stores. I had JCPenney, Macy's, and I think Sears. Most of what I wore in grade school, junior high, and high school was bought at either that tiny-ass mall or Kmart or Shopko, which were nearby. Other than those stores, I think them all had a Hallmark store, a jewelry store, tiny music store, a few other stores, all of them pretty small. Even the anchor stores, pretty small. Like, we're not talking like a New York City Macy's. We're talking one big room on one floor. The whole mall, one floor. It's barely a mall. And I wandered away from my grandparents one day, probably being a little jackass. Probably hide in the middle of those clothes racks that I used to do a lot. God, that would piss off my mom. And then, when I came out from wherever I was wandering or hiding, I couldn't find them. And I immediately panicked. And I thought that they forgot me and just went back to Riggins. Like, that's a thing that would happen. Like, they were like, well, I don't know where he is. Let's just go home. And I started crying. And some manager noticed me crying. I thought he was going to kidnap me. He calmed me down enough to find out that, I was looking for my grandpa. And so he, asked, like, could Ward Hall, please come to Sears and pick up his grandson, Danny? Could Ward Hall please come to Sears and pick up, whatever the section. So he comes to get me. I'm sure he was embarrassed. Probably took him 30 seconds to walk from wherever he was in the mall to wherever I was. And then he didn't get mad at me. Even by the time he made it, even though I was ugly crying by the time he made it to me. He didn't yell at me. He didn't yell at me that day or any other day. I literally don't have a single memory of him ever yelling at me. Not once in my whole life. He walked me over to Orange Julius, and he calmed me down with, no surprise, an Orange Julius. Maybe a hot dog. And all was good in the world again. What the fuck even is an orange Julius, by the way? I've never looked into it. It's like an orange juice, but not. It lives somewhere between juice and smoothie. It's not either one. Anyway, Lewiston was founded in 1861 after the nearby town of Pierce had a minor gold rush in 1860. Gold is what brought most of the early settlers to Idaho. Pierce is a little town of about 500 now. It's where gold was first discovered in present-day Idaho. In 1849, Elias Davidson Pierce had made it to California for that big 1849ers, right? The 49ers gold rush. And after really learning how to mine in California and serving in California's House of Representatives, he headed north, then east, and he became Idaho's first successful miner. Gold then drove tens of thousands of miners into Idaho over the next few months. The Clearwater Gold Rush. Yeah! There's more than taters in those hills. There's gold. Gold and taters in them hills. Seeking the pay dirt, following Pierce's discovery of gold on Orfino Creek in October 1860, there were so many people coming in that, according to Pierce, they made the hills and mountains ring with shouts of joy. The mining camp of Oro Fino, Spanish for fine gold, sprang up shortly after gold was found, right, 2 miles away in Pierce. Within a few weeks, 60 buildings were built. Within a few weeks, 9 or 10 stores, bunch of saloons, couple blacksmiths, etc. I mean, they're just throwing shit up as fast as they can to make some money off this gold rush. Orofino became Orfino. That's how it's said now. And I remember playing Orfino in basketball, their school, when I was in junior high. Weird story about Orfino to show how backwoods my homeland was and is. Orfino is home to the Idaho State Hospital North, an asylum, first opened in 1905. I believe a girl from my graduating high school class of just 23 kids works there right now. It's been a home for people suffering from mental illness for over 115 years. And in 1927, the Orfino High School, they decided that their basketball team, and then all their sports teams, should be called the Maniacs. Yeah, you heard that right. The mascot for the high school that sits like 2 blocks from this, not even, like a block and a half from the state asylum, is the fucking Maniacs. The official story behind the name is that Orfino, not having the resources to provide its players with basketball uniforms at the time in that 1927 game, they got teased by some Kamei fans. Kamei, little tiny town, 22 miles down the highway, where a couple of my cousins live. Kamei fans said that the Orfino players, played their hearts out, played so hard that they looked like, quote, a bunch of maniacs. I wonder why they used that word. I wonder if it was because, kids in Kamei who didn't live very far away definitely knew about the Orfino Asylum, the biggest asylum in Idaho at that time. Like, it would have been the biggest building in town at that time. To this day, the school refuses to change the name of its mascot. Their mascot is a dude who looks severely mentally ill, painted on the wall of their gym, jumping up and screaming. The high school is like, I looked on the map, it's literally like 800 feet from the mental hospital, and they still call themselves the fucking Maniacs. And back in 1993, the Idaho Alliance for the Mentally Ill wrote a letter to the Orfino Joint School District School Board requesting that the mascot be abandoned because it stigmatizes and perpetuates the old stereotype attached to the mentally ill. And then a bunch of townsfolk got mad that they wanted to change it, showed up to the meeting wearing all kinds of Orfino Maniac gear, hats, fucking jackets, a little fucking, probably, like flags they're waving, and they voted down, like in a landslide, to not change the name. And then my high school and junior high, the one Papa Ward's house is about a stone's throw away from, our mascot was and is still the Savage. It's an American Indian on horseback called a Savage. Eek! A Nez Perce protester of this mascot once said that the word savage is as offensive to indigenous peoples as the N-word is to African Americans, which makes sense. They're not fucking savages. They're modern people. They have artists, doctors, lawyers. They're every bit as cultured and civilized as anyone else in America. It's so inflammatory. And Riggins also refuses to change the name. The school district administrator defended the decision recently to keep the name, saying that the term savage doesn't really mean anything about American Indians. It's coincidence, right? It's just someone who plays hard or fights really hard for what they believe in. Kind of like, a maniac. Maniacs and savages. They're just people who play hard at sports. They're definitely not the mentally ill. They're definitely not American Indians. Get the fuck out of here. When I was in junior high, I was on, the basketball team, and the Savages played the Maniacs. Holy hell. And some in Idaho wonder why, in many people's eyes, we are a hillbilly laughingstock of a state. Back to 1860 now. Things are just getting going in Idaho. White settler, population-wise. There are a couple missions, some early homesteaders, some fur trapping, and now a small gold rush up north by Lewiston. 2 years later, much bigger gold rush kicks off in the Boise Basin. The area around Idaho's biggest city and state capital, an area 78 miles south of where Papa Ward was born, have been populated by members of the Shoshone and Bannock peoples for thousands of years. And then the Pacific Fur Company's Astor expedition brought whites to the area for the first time in 1811. John Reed, part of that Astor expedition, and a small party of Pacific Fur Company traders established an outpost near where the Boise River meets the Snake River in 1813. The post would soon be abandoned due to hostilities with local tribes. Another trading post would be established a few years later, also abandoned due to ongoing hostilities. 1819, same thing, with yet another post. 1834, Thomas McKay, a fur trader who had worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, then builds Fort Boise over on the Idaho-Oregon border. It would be abandoned. After more hostilities, several rebuilds in 1854. It's abandoned. Finally, a new Fort Boise is built in 1863 as a military outpost in present-day Boise to help protect a whole bunch of gold prospectors who had just poured into the area in the past year. Let's talk about this gold rush. It's a huge one that really never gets any attention. George Grimes heard a tale by some local Native Americans about so much gold laying about. He hears a tale in Walla Walla where he's at. You could just literally pick it up by the handful. And he was inspired to go check it out. He and a group of prospectors from Walla Walla in Washington set out for what would later be known as the Boise Basin in 1862, where he discovers that crazy story to be pretty close to the truth. Just gold laying all over the fucking ground, right? Like shallow streams just laden with gold. How pumped were those guys? Over a decade after the big 1849 California gold rush, with stories of massive fortunes being built from various claims and all that madness, right, whirling around in your head, and then you hear about a place miners haven't made it to yet, where there's literally gold laying all over the ground, and then you make it there, and then it's true. Lot of celebratory moonshine drank that night. Unfortunately for George Grimes, he would never get to sell any of the gold he found. Grimes was murdered within just a few days of finding all that gold. Big bummer. Highest of highs to the deadest of deads. And we'll never know who did it. If not my dad, probably somebody's dad did it, right? You get it. Some thought he was killed by a greedy partner. The accepted story is that he was killed by local tribes. Or maybe they just made a convenient scapegoat. Whoever killed him, he never witnessed the result of the Boise Basin strike that his discovery started. Previous to gold being discovered in the Boise Basin, the area was a wilderness inhabited only by some tribes with a few mountain men, fur trappers occasionally passing through. Within 8 months of the strike, the area became the largest settled area of the Pacific Northwest. By 1863, the population, just the next year, the population of the area estimated as being between 25 and 70,000 people. At 25,000 to 70,000 people, more people living in the Boise Basin than there were living in Portland, Oregon, or Seattle, Washington at that time. The actual rush years lasted from 1862 to 1864. Right, those big gold strikes, always pretty quick. The Boise Basin gold strike turned out to be one of the richest strikes in American history. Various articles say this gold strike was bigger than any of the now much more famous California gold strikes. Idaho, in addition to sometimes being crazy as hell, often also a very humble state. Not kidding. Local Idaho culture, I think, is to not really make a big deal out of stuff. We don't seem like we're showing off. We're not bragging or something. For a hard-working gold miner in a good location during the strike, a week of prospecting could yield $2,000. Right? That's over 60 grand in today's dollars. Fortunes were made quickly. Making anywhere from $8 to $20 a day was common. That's $250 to around $650 in today's dollars. The work was hard. Bench gravels often had to be packed in backpacks, transported to the water, but a hard-working miner often made $50 to $60 per day. That's up to $2,000 a day in today's dollars. Then by 1870, after cooling off in 1864, the rush was completely over. Mining continued, but not the same way. Not at the same feverish pace. Most of the easy stream, gravels were considered played out, and many claims were sold to Chinese miners who then were willing to work the lower grade claims, which continued to be profitable for them. In the 1870s, numerous stamp mills were in operation. Quartz mining prospered, supporting the area for decades. Placer mining continued for a long stretch because it was not possible to work an area long enough in a season to deplete it quickly. Dredge mining began in 1898 and continued through the 1950s. All told, 2,800,000 ounces of gold estimated to have come out of there between 1863 and 1959. The big Boise gold rush brought in a lot of people. People like Packer John. His name sounds a lot like Papa John, except this guy didn't sell pizza, and he probably wasn't super racist. Actually, he probably was super racist. This was the 1860s. Packer John was the first known white man to head up north of Boise, the present-day area of Valley County sometime in either 1860 or 1861. Remember, this is the guy who established that first route between Lewiston and Boise. So sometime, 1860 or 1861, he makes it into Long Valley, where my grandpa was born, where my Aunt Stella and Uncle Mike now live near in McCall. There were other white men in surrounding areas, like around the boom town of Florence, first territorial capital of Idaho County. My hometown of Riggins is in Idaho County, town legendary among many Riggins. Florence was a gold strike town that went from nobody to about 9,000 people to nobody in 4 years, from 1861 to 1865. And then a few additional waves of mostly Chinese miners stayed until around 1890. Later waves of a little bit of mining took place all the way into the 1930s. Florence could be a suck unto itself, kind of a forgotten tombstone type of place. Right? They had a Mason's Lodge, library, school, tons of saloons, butchers, hostels, lots of outlaws, lots of gunfights in the street, gunfights in the gambling halls, all kinds of shit. A lot of yip yip yaw in Florence. A lot of all be your huckleberry. With all this mining being done around Florence, which sat 160, or while all this mining was being done around Florence, which sat 116 miles north of where Papa Ward was born, and about 40 miles from where he'd settled down in my hometown of Riggins, the area where Papa Ward grew up, that Long Valley area, remained largely unsettled. Packer John Welch had contracted to freight supplies from the Umatilla landing on the Columbia River, now on the border of Washington and Oregon, just south of Tri-Cities, a.k.a. the Dry Shitties, to the miners of Idaho City, 300 miles away. Idaho City, about 40 miles northeast of Boise, 70 miles from the Long Valley area of the Hall Homestead. Soon after making it to Idaho, Packer John established a supply station near what later became the town of Cascade as he took on the new job of bringing supplies back and forth between Lewiston and Boise. 270 miles, 270 rough, hard-traveled miles. No slow-moving rivers to float down, no paved highways, no roads, lots of real rugged mountains, lots of dangerous rivers and tensions between whites and local tribes. I'm sure these packing trips were a lot of fun. Also, very random thought, but how dirty do you think Packer John's balls were when he finally made it to either Lewiston or Boise, right? Like on a scale of 2 rotten pine cones dipped in mud and sprinkled in squirrel shit to a pair of moldy taters soaked in vinegar and then covered in a mixture of dog shit and pus from a boil. What do you think? Closer to the cones or closer to those groin taters? Good luck totally getting that thought out of your head rest of today. Then during the 1870s, prospectors, but I didn't think about that. I'm like, God, you'd be so fucking dirty. Time you made it someplace. During the 1870s, prospectors and miners followed in Packer John's footsteps to scour the valleys and surrounding mountains of central Idaho for more gold once the Boise Basin mining strike got a little, tough, when gold got hard to get there. Once in central Idaho, they encountered the peoples of the Sheep Eater tribe, a band of Shoshone, also known as the Tukadika, a people whose lives were once centered around the lives of the area's bighorn sheep. Papa Ward used to talk a lot about the Sheep Eaters and how they'd lived not long ago all around where I grew up. As a kid with Papa Ward, I sifted for arrowheads a few times, also found some spearheads. Most of them found 30 miles from Riggins on my stepdad's property near Whitebird, named after Chief Whitebird, leader of a band of Nez Perce. Maybe we found some Nez Perce arrows, maybe we found some Sheep Eater arrows. The Sheep Eaters were the rare tribe never to adapt using horses. The high mountain terrain they lived in, the rough, steep mountains I used to climb for something to do as a kid, not suitable for horses. They lived in small, self-sufficient groups, hunted bighorn sheep, followed them all around the mountains of central Idaho. Other sheep eaters lived in southeastern Idaho and Wyoming around Jackson Hole. And in the 1870s, the sheep eaters of the Long Valley around Cascade and Arling were removed and sent to reservations further south. Some mines were established in the general area, but nothing big, nothing compared to the big Boise Basin strike. By the late 1870s, most of the mining had dwindled down to just a few prospectors. Some of the miners, once the easy-to-get gold was all gone, they decided to squat and stay. These squatters weren't exactly legal homesteaders. They skipped all the paperwork, part of the whole homesteading deal, and just built a cabin wherever they wanted to live. Because who was going to kick them out? Like no one was around. There are still the ruins of old squatter cabins from the 1870s and the subsequent decades dotted all around where I grew up. People who came to mine or fur trap or hunt, grow some vegetables, trade, just be the fuck away from society. I love that they didn't file any paperwork or anything. All right, they just way out in the middle of nowhere, away from any roads or towns or any government officials, and they were just like, I reckon this spot looks good, plenty enough. You can cut down yonder pines, get some grubbing, stack these rocks, dig out a cellar, and I reckon I'll just live here for a few years or the rest of my life. It's like going camping on unmanaged land, but instead of throwing up a tent, you just threw up a cabin, and you just maybe stayed for the rest of your life. The first squatter near where my grandfather's grandfather got that original homestead was a man named James Horner He built a cabin on Clear Creek in 1881, just a few miles from the Hall homestead. Soon after, some other miners settled along the nearby Payette River. So, when my grandpa, where he settled, he's like within the first decade of people, my great-great-grandpa, whatever. In 1884, the first blacksmith shop was opened in the valley by L.S. Kimball, who'd come over all the way from Illinois. Around that time, another man named Maxey came to nearby Round Valley to fatten some hogs on the valley's camas roots. Sounds like something that a dude named Maxey would do. Fatten hogs and whatnot, right? Howdy, Maxey's my name and fattening hogs is my game. Pleased to meet you. Then Maxey would spit some tobacco into his hand and expect you to shake it. Also, whose balls are dirtier, Packer John's or Hogman Maxey? Another early Long Valley settler, Mr. Caroline Jarvis, bought his homestead in 1888. Dude named Caroline in 1888. Did not expect that, but that's what the source says. Johnny Cash's boy named Sue vibes there. Then in 1892, W.A. Billy Bacon. Billy Bacon! Why, if it ain't Billy Bacon! There's a Maxey hog over here. Billy Bacon came to Boise in 1863, married Sarah Jarvis, and built a log cabin I don't know why I love his name is Billy Bacon. Built a log cabin to begin his homestead in Round Valley. 1886, Jack Jasper, all these great names. Well, Jack Jasper, meet Billy Bacon. We need to go talk to Maxey the Hog Man. Anyways, Jack Jasper, he establishes a homestead, estimates that there were about 30 families in the valley in 1886. And then in 1888, the first post office in Valley County is opened. And around this time, I'm guessing in 1889, maybe 1888, Samuel Hall, Papa Ward's great-grandpa, shows up to this little area, starts working that land, one of the first homesteaders that appears to ever settle around what will later become the town of Cascade, near where Papa Ward grew up. The next year, 1890, Idaho becomes a state. 1893, Charles Hall, Ward's father, born in the Long Valley of Idaho on the Hall homestead. The homestead actually part of the little town of Arling, Idaho. Now Arling, just a few houses. Not sure a sign even designates it as a place anymore. Can't find anything about it on the web, really. I don't remember anyone ever talking about it to me. Most of Arling, just 8 miles up from Cascade, now lays at the bottom of a lake. Over the next 30 years, Charles Hall grows up with his 12 siblings. Eek! And I never heard Papa Ward once talk about a single aunt or uncle. So weird. 1916. This guy marries Hazel Viola Williams. Papa Ward's mom was just 16. Barely 16. Her family moved out west all the way from the little town of Horton Township in Elk County, Pennsylvania. Just 2 years earlier, in 1914, the Union Pacific completes track from Emmett, about 10 miles north of Boise, to McCall, 30 miles north of Cascade, making commercial logging in the area profitable. Logging then became, along with farming and ranching, the economic mainstay of Long Valley for many, many years. The railroad track passed right next to or through Cascade, and the town grew. The track also apparently ran right through part of the Hall homestead. I hope they got some money for that. Sounds like they may have gotten some train cars out of the deal that they would weirdly live in. More on that later. Charlie and Hazel, my great-grandparents, would have their first child together 10 months after getting married. Norma Ruth, born in October of 1917. Hazel still just 16. That same year, Valley County is created by the Idaho State Legislature. They'd have 7 more kids together before they had Papa Ward. He was their 9th child, born on the farm. 2 years after Ward, they had their 10th kid, Thomas. He'd end up settling down outside of Seattle. Ward was closest to his brother Tom, apparently when they were young. The two would move to Riggins together later, right before meeting my grandma Betty. The 11th child was Milton, born in 1936. He'd moved to Macon, Georgia. He was the brother I heard the most about growing up. Grandpa would go to visit him a few times. 12th child, Forrest, born in 1938. Good dude. Talked to him a lot at the funeral. He put in 20-plus years in the military, settled down in Nampa, Idaho. The couple separated around this time after Forrest was born, with half the kids then living with Hazel down in Cascade, the other half living on the farm with Charlie. A 13th child, Leo, was born to possibly a different father a year or so later. He would settle down in Boise. Leo, I have met him, and he is a character. The night before Grandpa's funeral, he traveled up to Riggins with his brother Forrest, and we were sitting in the living room. My Grandma Betty's home, the house from the opening of this suck, and somehow the topic of painful surgeries came up, and he told the most ridiculous story. He told us his most painful surgery he'd ever had story about getting some hemorrhoids removed. Well, actually, that's what he first opened with. He said it was hemorrhoids, and then he paused after he said hemorrhoids, and he goes, "Well, I probably shouldn't say this, but I thought it was hemorrhoids. Turned out it was actually an STD." And then he proceeded to explain in front of my grandma, his brother Forrest, Forrest's wife, my wife Lindsay, the kids, Kyler Monroe, my sister and her kids, some of my cousins, my mom, stepdad, aunt, uncle, how he had genital warts on his asshole, a lot of them. They built up for years and then had to be surgically removed because it was hard for him to sit down. And then after having the genital warts burned off of his butthole, he sat in some Epsom salt in a bath, and he said he felt like his butthole was on fire. Just talking about nasty ass shit like that in front of everybody, like it's not a big deal. It's in my blood to do that. Hail Nimrod. Not long after telling that story, Leo just said goodnight, said sorry about Papa Ward, and just went to his hotel. Like he hadn't just told, genital warts on his butthole story. That was my favorite part of that whole day, easily. Not so much for Grandma Betty. She did not find that funny. Kyler and Monroe, my niece, nephew, Ellie Bird, they're a little bit stunned. They were not expecting a lengthy tale about an 80-year-old man once getting genital warts burned off his asshole. Papa Ward would have found that tale both embarrassing and hilarious. Back to Papa Ward's childhood. Growing up, Grandpa made it sound like the kids on the farm just, a few miles from the kids in Cascade, never saw each other after their parents' divorce around 1936. His mom had more kids than she could handle. So did his dad. And despite living so close, they just parted ways and just stayed apart. My Grandma Betty said that Papa Ward never stayed at his mom's house. Right? He left when he was, or his parents split when he was 4. And then his siblings who went to live with his mom were not welcome back on the farm by his dad, like ever, for the rest of their childhoods. How fucked. Charlie Hall had no interest in seeing half of his kids ever again. And they were just down the road. They were just a few miles away. And then he wouldn't let, the other half of his kids know their siblings, right? Their other half, half of their siblings or their mom. So weird. Grandma Betty said Papa Ward never knew his mom. They were never close. His dad never remarried. Never really had a maternal figure in his life. His mom never seemed to remarry either. Grandma Betty says she also never worked. Family assumption. I mean, she had a lot of kids to take care of. Family assumption. She lived on welfare. Charlie worked as a freighter. Tough job. Carried goods via horses, kind of like Packer John. He carried goods via horseback into the Stibnite mining district, 60 miles away. 60 miles of mostly trails, no roads. Stibnite, now a ghost town. First mined in 1899, Stibnite kicked out gold, silver, antimony, and tungsten. And random fact, from 1941 to 1945, Stibnite mined and milled more tungsten and antimony than any other mine in the U.S. During that period, Stibnite produced 40% of the nation's domestic supply of tungsten, 90% of its antimony, both rare metals used in weapons manufacturing. Antimony found in nature, mainly in the mineral called stibnite. It's really pretty. It looks like silver. My great-grandpa John may have worked in that mine. I think so. He definitely worked in some other mines in the area. And as a kid, he gave me a big silver ore. Coolest rock I've ever had by far. When Papa Ward talked about his dad and his life on the old man's farm, which was very rare, he basically said that life was hard. He said he never really had a childhood. I remember one time him saying that literally no one ever bought him a toy. Like he was talking about some toy, teased me about being spoiled. And I thought he was kidding. He was not kidding. He literally never got a single toy in his childhood, apparently. And some of his older sisters, especially Charlotte and Florence, they were the ones to basically raise him. They were the ones who would tell a lot of these stories to Grandma Betty, who would verify all these details with me. I just talked to her the other night, interviewed her about all this. He said he had chores, lots of them, for as long as he could remember. He started milking cows at the age of either 4 or 5. He started helping to plow and harvest the fields at around the age of 6 or 7. When he didn't do his chores, his dad beat the shit out of him. Grandma Betty said a few of his siblings told her that for reasons never quite made clear, Papa Ward was his drunk father's whipping post, quote unquote. The only fun memory my grandpa ever shared with me of his childhood that I can remember was about going sledding on a nearby hill with some of his siblings and maybe some friends. He worked, he avoided his dad, he did a shit ton of farm work, he went to school until he dropped out of high school at some point. He went to a high school in Council, an hour's drive away. He went to go live with an older sister, not sure exactly when he left his dad's farm. I'm sure he couldn't wait to get the fuck out of there. He never talked to me much about his childhood, and never with Grandma Betty either. I asked her a bunch of questions, and she really didn't know many details. They were married for over 60 years, and he just never really talked about it. She didn't even know he had a terrible childhood until about 30 years into their marriage, when they were in Georgia, and one of Papa Ward's sisters finally told her, just took her aside and told her. She was blown away. Like he just did not want to talk about it. Going back to his early childhood, apparently on the homestead, the family didn't even live in a proper house. Grandpa told Grandma they lived in some weird configuration of old train boxcars that had been converted into living quarters. Like no electricity, no running water, no indoor toilets, just real country poor. They lived like fucking hobos. If the hobos, the train never moved. The grade school and junior high he went to, just a one-room schoolhouse, now sits at the bottom of Cascade Reservoir, known as Lake Cascade. Grandma Betty said most of the kids at that school during the brief time it was around were Halls. They were his relatives. They were either Papa Ward's siblings or his cousins. The lake was formed by a dam on the North Fork of the Payette River in 1948 when Papa Ward wasn't quite 16. The lake ended up covering part of the homestead. It has relatively shallow water controlled for irrigation, flood control, hydropower now. 1951, when Ward Hall was 19 after dropping out of high school and council, so he could get a full-time job working with heavy equipment on highway construction, he got his GED, signed up for the Air Force, and became an airplane mechanic. He served overseas in both Africa and Japan before receiving an honorable discharge in 1955. Why the Air Force? He told me he signed up to avoid being drafted into the Korean War into the infantry. He found out that if he signed up to enlist, he could steer his destiny a bit more. He didn't want to be drafted into the infantry because, quite simply, he didn't want to die in the Korean War like his brother had died in World War II. His older brother, Charles, born 11 years before he was born, had been drafted to fight in World War II, died in the Battle for Brest, fought in August and September on the Western Front at the age of 23. He was fought in France. Almost 10,000 Americans who fought in that battle were killed or wounded. The Allies won that battle. My grand-uncle died fighting Nazis and helping the Allies secure the port of Brest so Allied ships could supply the Allies, push east, and further beat the Nazis back towards Germany. Did not know that until this week's research. Fighting was intense. The Nazis had entrenched themselves in the port city of Brest. Allied soldiers, like my granduncle, had to battle them back, taking over one occupied house at a time. Just house to house, urban warfare. Eventually, the old city of Brest was razed to the ground during the battle, with only some medieval stone-built fortifications left standing. After the war, the West German government paid reparations to civilians in Brest who had been killed, starved, or left homeless because, everything they had was just fucking destroyed. My grandfather showed me pictures and coins that he collected years later during his military adventures when I was a kid. Sitting in his living room, I'd often flip through books of coins he kept from Africa, Japan, the South Pacific. I'd match the currency to a country on the globe. I thought it was so cool. I've been to so many places around the world. I still do. I'd only been to Idaho and to Alaska, where I'd lived from around the age of 2 to around the age of 7 that time, returning to Riggins when my parents divorced. My grandpa had been to multiple continents. I remember thinking how funny some pictures were he also kept from the war. Pictures of my young Papa Ward with a couple of ladies in Japan that he seemed to have been very fond of. Women who were definitely not my Grandma Betty. Even as a little kid, I would think, does Grandma Betty know about these ladies? Is she okay with this? Do I have cousins I don't know about? Apparently, at some point during the service, Papa Ward stayed in the same barracks as a man who would go on to become known as the Man in Black, Johnny Cash. He told this story a lot. Johnny Cash, the same age, also born in 1932. Cash was talking about music then, according to my grandpa, talking about his big musical dreams and ambitions. Grandpa said he thought he was full of shit. I was just a big talker. Cash would then release the huge country hit, I Walk the Line, the year after Grandpa got back home from the war. I guess Cash wasn't bullshit. I Walk the Line stayed on the charts for over 43 weeks, sold over 2 million records. That single did. When Grandpa returned to the States in 1955, he returned to a little bit of a different financial picture than Johnny Cash did. He had been sending extra money home for years to his dad so his dad could save that money for him so he could buy a car when he got back. Why did he send his money to his dad who he knew he was a piece of shit? I don't know. Maybe some attempt at reconciliation. He never said. What he did say was that his dad, Charlie the Old Man Hall, drank it all away and left him nothing. He served for 4 years, came back, didn't have a dime to show for it. Soon after returning home, he ended up getting a job running heavy equipment again on a construction crew. There was a big job near Riggins, Idaho, just north of town, near a little cluster of houses known as Lucille on Highway 95. They were repaving the highway there. His brother Tom came to work with him, and the two rented a house right across the street from where I went to grade school in Riggins, right by City Hall. Working at the Somerville's Diner in Riggins, about 100 yards down the street, was a hot young waitress, my Grandma Betty Berman, just 16 at the time. Grandpa was 23, and the young bachelor was a frequent customer. Somerville's is still there, by the way. I've eaten at the same counter where my grandma once served my grandpa food. And when my grandma first noticed the young, skinny veteran with the big grin, the big ears, and the blue eyes, she says he had a girlfriend, some woman from council with a few kids. She thought Ward and her were married. She asked him if they were married one day when he was in there without her. He said no. Betty and her friend Venice, same age. I remember Venice hanging out with my grandma all the time. Venice passed away in 2016. And Betty and Venice, they noticed Ward didn't come in a lot on the weekends. So they asked him one time, where was he? Where was he going? He said, to council, to date that woman. Grandma, clearly interested in Papa Ward. She had some Lucifina in her. She had him in her crosshairs. And my grandma asked him, why was he driving over an hour, right, to date someone? Why wasn't he dating somebody around town? One of the girls there. And she said, he said, because no one in town would go out with him. And so she said, adorable, I'll go out with you. And she told him there was a dance that next weekend, 20 miles up the Salmon River, at a little tavern by the mouth of French Creek. And Papa Ward loved to tell the story of how they met. He loved to brag that Grandma asked him out. He was real big on pointing that out. She asked me out. she asked me. One of his favorite stories to tell. Always had a big shit-eating grin telling that story. It's pretty cute. And he loved to point out that when they drove up the river, there was no dance. The dance had been called off for some reason or another. The dance never happened, but the date did. He said that she just wanted to get him alone up the river. The two were inseparable after that. No more councilwoman. Thank God I wouldn't be here anymore if he would have stayed with her. When Grandpa first dated Grandma, the company he worked for wanted Grandpa to keep repaving the highway with them and leave Riggins, go further north up the road. He didn't do that. His brother Tom took the job instead. Ward took a job at the Slate Creek Sawmill, a little sawmill 20 miles south of town, just so he could stay in Riggins with Grandma Betty. She said about this, why'd he stay? Because Papa Ward, she said, and she really emphasized this, really liked me. Adorable. He sure did. He loved the hell out of his Betty, and he never left Riggins, ever. Betty's parents, John and Stell, they liked Papa Ward right away. My grandma said her parents liked him because he was kind and respectful. Grandma liked him because he had a huge dick. That's what she told me the other night on the phone. If she was listening right now, she would be fucking slamming her phone down. Like, no, I did not say that. I would never say that. Why would he say? No, she said she liked him because he was very nice and respectful too. She said he was a gentleman. 1957, my grandma Betty graduated from San River High School in that May, I believe, maybe June. And then on August 24th, 1957, the two got married in Riggins. Took their little honeymoon right up here in Coeur d'Alene. Ward's brother Tom moved out of the house the two of them shared. Grandma Betty moved in, and they started saving up for their first house together. And before we go further into the history of Papa Ward, let's talk for a second about the town where they built their lives, where they raised their kids, where their daughter Charlene raised her kids, me and my sister Donna. I didn't know much about my hometown prior to this week, like as far as the history. And this is the last history lesson, by the way. The rest of it's just Papa Ward info. Riggins today, this kind of shocked me when I dove into it. Only about 250 people left, 258 in 2019. Had over 400 when I went to high school, over 500 when I was a little kid in grade school. It peaked out at around 600 in 1960. The U.S. Census first took note of Riggins in 1910. Just 60 people lived there at that time. 60 people lived where the Little Salmon River flows into the main fork of the Salmon. A lot less snow there than where Grandpa grew up in Cascade. I'm sure he loved that. Just 34 inches of snow per year, which seems high to me, actually. Most of the winter, no snow is on the ground in town in Riggins. It's at the bottom of a little canyon. Only 2 months have an average low of at or below freezing. Just December and January, they bottom out exactly at freezing, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. In July and August, the average low is just 65, and the average high is 95. It's hot, over 100 on a regular basis. It's pretty good weather-wise. A lot more snow and a lot colder weather just a half hour south and an hour to the north on the only highway that cuts through town, Highway 95, but Riggins like this little banana belt kind of climate. Shout out to the Riggins Chamber of Commerce and Harold Wisdom. Grandma Betty went to high school with his sister Betty Jane Wisdom for this next bit of info. Because previous info on the web, and this was just posted on the web like about a year ago. And previous to about a year ago, the best information you could find about the history of Riggins came from one of my best friend's dad, who I won't name to embarrass him, but he was fucking way off. Like the accepted history of Riggins was off by a lot of the dates, but I'm talking like 30, 40 years. The following is the best explanation of how Riggins came to be that I've ever heard. In 1863, Mike Deasy, a miner, stopped on the way to the boomtown of Florence that I mentioned earlier, and the still barely around, gold strike town of Warren. I went there as a kid to explore the bar. A bar in this context being an elevated region of sediment, such as sand or gravel that has been deposited by river flow. At the confluence of the Little and Big Salmon Rivers, where the town of Riggins sits today, he found traces of gold on the north end of the bar, just not enough to keep him from heading on over. He continued to Florence, and then later at some point he returned to the bar to do some placer mining while he wintered his horses on the bar. He laid claim to the entire bar from what was to become the Aitken Ranch just south of town, along the Little Salmon River to what is now North Riggins, at the northern end of the bar. He did some placer mining along the bar, wasn't sure what to do with his claim, didn't find enough gold to hold his interest. Placer mining, by the way, is that classic old-timey prospected there's gold in them hills type of mining most people think of. It's that practice of like separating heavily eroded minerals, like gold from sand or gravel. It can mean anything from using a gold pan right, to sift through the water, get the gold out of there, to a screen to separate the sand from the gold, to a dredge that'll bring up sediment from the river bottom to sift and separate gold from everything else. People still have, today, dredges running around Riggins and the Salmon River. A few little claims burn into the mountains around town, too. Other than Mike Deasy, no one dicked around looking for gold in the area that was to become Riggins for about 40 years. And then in 1891, two men, Johnny Irwin and Charlie Clay, were prospecting for gold on the northern end of the bar. They thought they'd found promising ore, but they had to negotiate with Mike Deasy before working their site. Johnny and Charlie traded 2 spotted ponies and a watch for Deasy's claim to the entire bar. I love it. How much you want for that claim, Deasy? How does $5,000 sound? I'll give you 2 spotted ponies and a watch. And then, deal. 1893, Johnny Irwin's father, Isaac Irwin Jr., sold his Round Valley homestead for $180. Round Valley, about 10 miles south of the Hall homestead. Moved his family down to the Little Salmon River, to the bar at the confluence of the Big Salmon River, with his wife Mary and sons George, Byron, Noah, and Ike. They built their first house on the bar. I love that the original Irwin's homestead was just a few miles away from the Hall homestead. Papa Ward would follow the Irwins to Riggins about 60 years later. The Irwins and Clays realized that hydraulic mining was the only practical method of mining that bar at the north end of the claim, but there was no ready source of water where they wanted to mine for that purpose. So accordingly, they spent the next 2 to 3 years digging this large 1 mile and a half long ditch from Squaw Creek to what's called North Riggins to provide water to to this hydraulic mine to mine the bar. That ditch now runs across my Grandma Betty's property. I played in it as a kid. Papa Ward and Grandma Betty's first home they owned together was in a little block of homes called North Riggins. When I was born, my parents lived in North Riggins. It's where I spent most of my childhood. A ditch runs through North Riggins, too, and I lost a lizard I caught by the high school and told myself was my pet. I called him Speedy because he always tried to run away from me, probably because he fucking hated me. And he wasn't a pet. I kept him on my shoulder, and one day, standing next to that ditch, he jumped off and killed himself. He drowned himself, and that is one of my worst memories. As a kid, I was like, Speedy hates me so much, he drowned himself in the ditch. Random memory jogged by this story. Anyway, that ditch was dug with just a pick, shovel, and a horse. And then, unfortunately, the ore content of the sand was meager and not worth the effort of digging that ditch. But now the Irwins and Clays had a nice piece of land, had a ditch through it that could provide water for homes and crops. There's a 22-unit set of low-income apartments in the middle of town now called the Irwin Center. My Grandma Betty worked across the street from the Irwin Center at the post office for about 30 years. My mom worked next door to the post office at the bank for almost 20 years. Right by the Irwin Center, named after this original settler. Johnny Irwin and Charlie Clay. I was friends growing up with a descendant of Charlie Clay, Thomas Clay, who lives in Riggins now. Caught a bus with him to school for years. Same bus stop. Worked at the grocery store with his aunt. Johnny and Charlie decided to capitalize on the fact that the bar was the only sizable piece of level ground along the river large enough to build stores, hotels, other businesses necessary to support a town. Dick, Noah, Ike Irwin, Charlie Clay then took out homesteads on the bar. Dick homesteaded the north portion of the bar. Ike homesteaded the south portion. Noah and Charlie homesteaded at the center of the bar, which is now the business section of Riggins. If you've ever been to the Chevron station in Riggins, that's where Charlie Clay had one of the original houses in the area. More people soon moved into the area in the late 1890s. Miners heading through town soon started settling down there. Became a supply stop along the Salmon River for miners and loggers mostly. A man named Dick Riggins. Fucking Dick Riggins. That's a powerful name. What's your name? It's fucking Dick Riggins. There's a lot of testosterone in that name. He built a small hotel and livery barn on Charlie Clay's homestead and soon filed to open a post office. And the post office, needed a name for the town. And the name a lot of people wanted to give the town, it was the name of the town at that time, as far as just, what people would call it, was Gougei. Riggins tried to be Gougei. The origin of that name came from a Saturday dance in some schoolhouse nearby when Homer Lavander and Big Markham, that's literally how his name is written in the history books, Big Markham. What's Markham's first name? Big. Why? You fucking know why. Only Big Markham could take down Dick Riggins. No, but these two guys got into a fight over a woman named Daisy Trumbull. Oh, Daisy, what a looker. Markham was getting the best of the fight. He was a bigger man. Of course he was. He's Big Markham. And then Homer gouged his eye. Some say he gouged his eye clean out. For a few years, the town was called Gougei. But the government was like, we're not fucking giving a post office to a place called Gougei. So Riggins had to come up with a new name. And then Dick Riggins suggested Irwin, Clay Irwin Bar. Those suggestions were rejected because apparently there were already little towns by those names in the U.S., like a couple of each, which is crazy to me. Never heard of towns by those names. The Postal Department then suggested the name Riggins because there was only one town in Missouri by that name at the time. The townspeople agreed, but it was going to be not in honor of Dick. This is made clear in the sources. It was in honor of Dick's father, John Riggins, who carried mail to the region for the past couple of years. So in 1902, Riggins opened a post office in Dick's hotel and named it Riggins. Riggins subsequently sold his hotel to another Dick, Dick Irwin. Dick Riggins selling to Dick Irwin. I'll sell this hotel, but only to another Dick. Dick Irwin and his wife Leona bought it. Then the post office was put under the supervision of Leona in 1904. And then there was a town. Now it's a town. People are ranching cattle, sheep in the nearby mountains for food to be sold to various prospectors. When the National Forest Service Reserve was formed in 1897, there were already almost 14,000 head of cattle and 70,000 sheep permitted on the nearby Nez Perce National Forest. Crops were being grown wherever some flat land was found on the Salmon River Canyon. As the area prospered, the need for lumber grew, and the Salmon River's timber industry was born. Since it was easier to haul lumber than logs, lumber was cut in the mountains, packed out on horseback. Soon roads were built, rough lumber was freighted to town. Eventually, there were small sawmills up nearly every stream and gulch. Right, my grandpa would work at one of those at Slate Creek. When the advent of timber sales from nearby public lands in 1945 went down, the lumber industry became the base for the area economy and remained so for many years. The sawmill having the greatest impact on Riggins was the Salmon River Lumber Company, originally started by George Jensen, right around 1945. Later, Warren Brown developed the company located at the confluence of the Little Salmon and Main Rivers to include a sawmill, shipping operation, planing mill, dry kiln, and logging operation. And that company was the community's major employer until 1982 when the sawmill burned down. And that's why the population's been decreasing. It's like a whitewater rafting town now, but it just doesn't have as many jobs as it did when there was a sawmill. Warren Brown Sawmill employed my dad at a time. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what he was doing exactly there. Probably taking a lot of time off, to travel around the country and do God knows what. You get it. It employed Papa Ward, also his father-in-law, Grandpa John Berman, Grandma Betty's father from Sweden, and John's brother Sig and Axel Berman, that guy, Betty's uncle. He would sell Papa Ward and Grandma Betty the land for their first house that they would own together. And that guy terrified me as a kid. He was an old man when I knew him as a kid. He always seemed grouchy. He was big. He was burly. He spoke with a really thick Swedish accent. He seemed very serious all the time. And he had one arm. He'd lost an arm, and instead of having his shirts tailored, he would sometimes just stuff the sleeve without the arm into the front of it in his front shirt pocket. And he was missing parts of 3 fingers on his remaining hand. And he just had a menacing presence. He lost his arm in the sawmill, got caught in the planer. It just shredded his arm, mangled it into ground beef. He barely survived the blood loss of that wound. Then he retires from the sawmill, and then he takes up fucking woodworking. He put a table saw in his shop, and he lost 3 different fingertips in 3 separate accidents over the subsequent years. Few of his fingers down to the knuckle. Dude was the epitome of the stereotype of the stubborn Swede. That if I lost an arm in a sawmill accident, priority number 1, numero uno, going forward, avoid saws. Stay away from extra saws at all costs. He clearly felt differently. That hoingy-boingy son of a bitch, he liked to live dangerously. On May 7th, 1958, my mom, Scandal, was born. Full term, less than 9 months after my grandma and grandpa got married. What the flipping fuck? So my grandma was pregnant on her wedding night. Ugh! Those 2 horny kids were knocking it out. No birth control, couple of raw doggers. Fucking grandpa and grandma raw dog. You get it. When my mom was born, she's going to fucking kill me if she ever listens to this. I'll never be allowed home. Papa Ward was 25, Grandma Betty just 18. I hope she never listens, Jesus Christ. Around 1958, my grandma uses her waitress money to buy a small plot of land from her uncle Axel. Then Papa Ward built him a house on the weekends and evenings. He wasn't working at the sawmill. Dug out the foundation and cellar with a shovel, no backhoe. Used his own back instead. Poured the concrete himself, built the house himself. Talk about sweat equity. Grandma Betty said he was always a hard worker. Never one for laying around. She said she used her waitress money to buy the house. Grandpa Ward built the house. 2 years later, 1960, one of my favorite stories from my family. Papa Ward and Grandma Betty had their second and only child, my aunt, Stella Jean. How she was delivered is insane. Early in the morning of May 22nd, 1960, around 6 a.m., Grandma Betty goes into labor with her second and final child. She and my grandpa grabbed my mom, Charlene, hopped in their 1950 Plymouth coupe. They drop off Charlene at John and Stell's, Grandma's parents. Ward and Betty then drive a little over 30 miles to New Meadows, take a right to stay on, Highway 95, drive another 7 miles to the Tamarack Sawmill. Stell was starting to come out of my grandma's vagina, so Grandpa pulled over, ran over, knocked on the door of the owner of the mill's house, I guess his house was attached to the mill, asked to use their phone to call an ambulance, and that son of a bitch wouldn't let him in. Wouldn't let him use the phone. Fucking shut the door on him. He was mad, I guess, because that guy, because Grandpa Ward woke him up. He was, quote, of no help, said my grandma. What a dick. You know what time it is, buddy? Sorry, my wife is having a baby in that car right now. Please, it's a snowstorm. My wife's having a baby. The baby's coming out. Can we please use your phone? And keep me awake longer? No, thank you. I'm going to lay down and forget about not helping a young couple in need of a simple, easy-to-accommodate favor. You can go fuck yourself. Slam. It was another 18 miles to Council. Just a 20-minute drive to the hospital there, but that baby was coming out right now. My aunt was knocking on my grandma's door, and by door, I mean where her vagina ended, and some other stuff began. I'm actually kind of starting to gross myself out now. They started driving, and then now around 7 a.m., they pull over on the side of the road, and it turned out there had been a late winter storm. There's snow all over. Grandpa runs around, opens the passenger door, gets down on his knees in the snow, helps deliver the baby right there on the side of the road, uses his farm skills. I'm not even kidding. He hands Grandma his daughter, and still umbilical cord still attached, tries to start the car. It will not start. They're freaking out now. He tells Grandma to hold her newborn baby, scoot over to the driver's seat. She holds the baby in one hand, still attached to her, while he runs around to the back to push the car to help get it started, while Grandma uses her free hand to turn the key and pump the gas pedal. Pumps gas, with her foot, obviously. The car starts. Grandma slides back to the passenger seat. Grandpa drives her the rest of the way to Council, where he runs through the snow to ask for a nurse, who then runs out into the parking lot to cut the umbilical cord in the car. How dramatic. It's like something out of a movie. Grandma's then helped into the hospital, where she stays for a few days. Grandpa left his car in the parking lot, walks over to a nearby hotel, stays there for a few days. He said he wasn't getting back into that car until Grandma came back and cleaned up the fucking mess she made. Get in there, lady. Clean up your blood and baby juice. It's not going to clean itself. No, I'm kidding. That's terrible. No, he cleaned it up. He never said a word about it. He's a gentleman. The two of them then decided not to have any more kids. I bet. They were traumatized. Grandma said they were both pretty shook up by that. Yeah, I bet. For the next 16 years, they raised both their daughters at home until, my mom turns 18 and moves out. And they have a great life. Grandpa soon gets a job at the sawmill in town, and his commute goes from 20 miles to 1 mile. No stoplights, just one stop sign. They buy a few other lots in North Riggins over the years. Grandma, she works for the Forest Service. Then she works for the post office, where she'll work for about 30 years. Great job. He builds these rentals by himself mainly. He ended up with 5 or 6 rentals in town. They take some family vacations. They get a few dogs. They play some cribbage, rummy, lots of board games in my family, a lot of Yahtzee. Grandma starts a weekly bridge game with friends that she still plays today. Grandpa quit smoking at the age of 36. He had started smoking at the age of 16. Grandpa bet his mother-in-law, Grandma Stella, a silver dollar he could quit, just like that, because she didn't like him smoking. So he did. And then years later, he told Grandma Betty that he was pretty irritated. Grandma still hadn't paid him that silver dollar. Grandpa fished a lot, bought a little boat he kept tied to the bank of the Salmon River below his house. I caught a steelhead with Grandpa in the river behind his house in that boat. Hunted deer. He caught salmon and trout, smoked them, tended to his vegetable garden, watched his kids grow. You couldn't get him to eat fish later in life because he said he ate too much of them growing up because he was poor. He got embarrassed when his wife wrestled his daughters in the living room, and he would tell them to at least close the blinds for God's sake so the neighbors couldn't watch. Grandma Betty and her 2 girls, laughing and joking around all the time. Grandpa always watched them shaking his head. At some point, Grandpa became a volunteer EMT for a while, worked for a while as a city inspector. He was very active in the VFW hall there, did a lot of fundraising for them. He became the mayor for a while. He would help at the Riggins Rodeo every year. He was the grand marshal of the parade one year. He said there was no campaign to run for mayor when he became mayor. He said, quote, he was just the only one dumb enough to do it. Interesting political fact about my grandpa. He was a lifelong Democrat in a town that bled and bleeds red. It's about 97% Republican and mostly far right. All of Grandpa's friends, and he had many, all Republican, and he would talk to them about politics at a men's breakfast they had every week for years and years. And they disagreed on just about everything political, and they stayed friends. How about that shit? Turns out we don't have to hate those who disagree with us politically. We can actually not be petulant children, and we can get along with people who have different political opinions. Who would have thunk it? If my grandpa and his friends didn't tell anyone their political views, you would have guessed they weren't different, right? They looked pretty much the same. They had different ideas, different opinions of how things should be run, but they basically lived the same lives, had the same morals. Papa Ward was also the odd man out religion-wise. A lot of his friends went to church. He didn't. And Riggins, he felt he saw too much hypocrisy with the religion going on there. There was the party hard bar crowd and the church crowd, and they were the same crowd. And then there was, everybody else. The way my grandpa told it to me, he would watch people, go hard on the bars for a while, cheat on their spouses, ignore their families, waste money on partying, then feel guilty about it, then be threatened with divorce or get divorced or something, whatever. Then they get real into the church again for a while, get real holier than thou with everyone, and then go right back to party. Just go back and forth for years. Meanwhile, with no church, Grandpa remained focused on family and kept his morals consistent. One Easter, he and Grandma and the kids, Charlene and Estelle, went to church in town, the Assembly of God, where my other grandpa, Bill Cummins, my dad's dad, would later preach for many years when his family moved to town in the mid-'70s. Both he and his wife, my grandma Carol, buried not far from Papa Ward right now. And anyway, at this service, the pastor made a point to thank the real Christians who supported the church all year long and didn't just come, for Easter. And Grandpa felt singled out by that, and so he just stood up. Grandma Betty stood up, and they just walked the fuck out and never came back. He told me it made him feel kind of disgusted to be judged by those who, in his mind, were not following Christian ideals nearly as well as he was. Felt he didn't need the pastor's approval. He was already living a righteous life. And dear Christian meat sacks, I do realize that the people my grandpa found hypocritical do not represent at all Christians. My Aunt Stell, the one who got delivered in the car, she's very religious and it never bothered Papa Ward one bit. 1976, Ward and Betty's eldest daughter, my mom Charlene, graduates from high school at the age 18. She's already dating my dad, Daniel Neil Cummins, who's 22. And from what I understand, who can't totally account for his whereabouts this year or the previous few years. Typical. Check this out. 2 years earlier, 9 women killed by Ted Bundy in Washington, Oregon. What state neighbors both of those states? What state is the only state to border both Washington and Oregon? Idaho. Where was my dad living in 1974? Idaho. Did Bundy's victims look kind of like my mom? Yep. Did a young Ted Bundy look kind of like my dad when he was young? Mm-hmm. Do police make mistakes sometimes and attribute victims to the wrong killer? Yes. Do I think my dad is actually the guy who killed those Ted Bundy victims? I'm not going to say I think so, but I mean, fuck, you lay it out there like that, there's a chance. 1976, my mom, I don't know, that joke still hasn't gotten tired for me. 1976, my mom and dad get married the year after graduation. On May 17th, 1977, I am born. Another weird birth in the family. I am barely born. I'm sure you've heard about babies who end up, sometimes tragically strangled to death when their umbilical cord gets wrapped around their neck. It is much more rare, but it sometimes happened. What happened to me, when I was born, my dick got wrapped around my neck, and I couldn't breathe for a little while. No one remembers the exact number, but my baby dick was wrapped around my neck either 3 or 4 times, which I guess is kind of rare. No, I was born fine. Come on. No, I was born fine. No, I was born with jaundice because my mom, wasn't taking vitamins or vegetables probably. And then I was a formula-fed baby, which is probably why I have allergy and digestive problems and a chronically weak immune system. But I'm not upset about that. Not upset about mom. Papa Ward was apparently overjoyed that he now had a baby boy around. My mom and Aunt Stella have teased me literally my whole life that Papa Ward considered me more of a son than a grandson and that he liked me more than them. Not kidding. It gets a little weird sometimes. In my grandpa's defense, my mom and sister were shitty kids sometimes growing up. They had to be spanked. I never had to be. I never gave my grandpa any trouble. So maybe if they wanted to be loved more, they should have been fucking cooler kids, Think about that. Take some responsibility for how you are as a kid. My grandma Betty also overjoyed to have a grandkid. I was apparently spoiled rotten as a baby by my grandparents, who lived just 3 houses away when I was born. My mom seems a little annoyed to this day that even as a baby, I seem to want to be around them more than my actual parents, which would be pretty annoying as a parent. But maybe they should have stepped up their parent game, right? Made life more fun for me at home. Not going to get down on the floor and play with me, lady? Not going to make me a nummy lunch or a tasty dinner? Huh? Dad? Huh? Not going to play hide and seek? Lawn bowling in the yard? Not going to read me some cool stories? Well, then go fuck yourselves. I'm off to Papa Ward and Grandma Betty's house. In all seriousness, they really did dote on me. I don't have any memories of hanging out with Papa Ward before my dad took off to Anchorage, Alaska when I was 2. And then my mom and I followed not long after, but I know we hung out a bunch. I do have a box of postcards somewhere. My grandma wrote me postcards all the time when I was a little kid. Once I did go to Alaska, pretty adorable. Sometime around the end of 1979, beginning of 1980, my mom and I leave Riggins to head up to Anchorage, live with my dad. When my dad was alone up in Anchorage, this is interesting, in late 79, 80, did you know that 5 women were apparently killed by the butcher baker serial killer, Robert Hansen? 5 women from Anchorage, young women. Do you know that my dad was really into young women at that time? It is unreal how often this stuff comes up when you really look into it. One woman went missing on June 28th, 1980. Where was my dad that night? Well, your guess is as good as mine. Anyway, Papa Ward and Grandma Betty would head up to visit a few times over the next few years. My mom and I would then head back down to Riggins for long summer breaks. During one of those early summer breaks, I had my first memories of Papa Ward. My mom and I spent summers at Papa Ward's and Grandma Betty's house, and I remember him taking me fishing in Lost Valley Reservoir. He called it Lost Lake Reservoir. I was confusing it with Lost Valley, but Lost Lake. About 45 miles from Riggins, down Highway 95 to Tamarack, right, where that fucking guy wouldn't let him in that one night. I remember trolling in the little fishing boat he had, catching trout, then catching tadpoles along the shore. I brought a bunch of those tadpoles home one summer, put them in a kiddie pool in the backyard, and they grew up and became frogs and hopped away. It's pretty cool kid experience. August 1st, 1982, my sister Donna is born in Anchorage, and apparently I was furious. When she was brought home from the hospital, I demanded that my parents take her back, and they did not, and it's still a little annoying. Now, I'm mostly okay that we kept her. She's pretty good. 1984, my parents split up. My mom moved my sister and I back with her to Riggins, Idaho. My dad stayed in Anchorage. 5 different bodies attributed to serial killer Robert Hansen found in Alaska in 84 and 85, when he was kind of upset about the divorce. So that's also pretty weird. Papa Ward, him being the rock of the family, my first memory of him comes from my final days living in Anchorage. First memory of him being like the rock of the family. He was 42 years old in 84, a bit younger than I am now, which is so weird for me to think about. He took time off work, flew up by himself out of Boise into Anchorage. I was a daddy's boy in Alaska. I wanted to stay with my dad after the divorce, but that's just not how things were going to go down. I was confused. I didn't know any other kids whose parents had been divorced. When I went back to Riggins, I was actually the only kid in the grade school, as far as I can remember, whose parents were divorced. I was in 3rd grade when I went back. But my grandpa, he knew divorce, and he knew how to console me, right? Console me like his shithead dad never consoled him. He was such a rock. He took Don on me to my favorite restaurant, Skipper's. French fries and clam chowder. I was quite the culinary sophisticate. He took me to Fred Meyer's, my favorite store. Got me some G.I. Joe action figures, maybe a He-Man or two. Amazing how much that cushioned the blow a bit. Then he packed all my mom and my sister's stuff into a U-Haul trailer and drove his daughter and grandkids back to Riggins. 2,600 miles. I remember laying on the back seat while my sister laid on the floorboards. I remember driving up and down some pretty steep mountains on a pretty skinny highway, being real nervous. My grandpa never seemed nervous. He always drove the family on trips. You always felt safe with him behind the wheel. Listened to a lot of Oak Ridge Boys that trip. Elvira, my heart's on fire for Elvira. And I remember they had that breakdown. It's giddy up, bop, bop, mow, mow, giddy up, bop, mow. Whatever happened to the Oak Ridge Boys? Grandpa never caused a wreck, never got in a wreck driving. He actually never got a single speeding ticket or parking infraction his entire life. About 70 years of driving. When we got back home to Riggins, I missed the hell out of my dad, but I loved living with Grandma and Grandpa. Papa Ward gave me a BB gun, put me on patrol on a deck he had off the backyard overlooking the Salmon River, flanked by some big pines. I was told to shoot any woodpeckers on sight and not to get caught because it was a big fine to get caught shooting woodpeckers. But they pecked a hole in the roof of the shop, and they were on the to be cold. They were his emus. I soon learned that woodpeckers pretty hard to kill with the Daisy air rifle. They're tough little birds. Robins, not so much. Poor robins. They just wanted a worm, and then they got fucking shot. They got sniped, right, by Corporal Cummins sitting on the deck. Grandpa at that time was working construction with a man named Mike Gazinski. A dirty pole. God. Mike had a daughter, Michelle, in my class. Another daughter, Crystal, a few years older. I had crushes on both of them. Beautiful girls who became beautiful women. I have long been tormented and attracted to the dirty poles. Funny that I ended up marrying a ski. My grandpa used to love to tease Mike, who was his best friend at the time, with Pollock jokes. Definitely got some of my ridiculous, stupid humor from my grandpa Ward. Here's the first joke I can ever remember learning. This is a joke I remember my grandpa telling Mike Kaczynski. He said, 2 Pollocks were out hunting deer, way out in the woods. The first afternoon, one of them starts feeling sick to his stomach, and he heads back to camp to lay down, wait for some gas, some cramping to pass. The second one keeps hunting. Sure enough, he soon shoots himself a buck, and he hauls it back to camp. When he makes it back, he finds that the first Pollock is out cold, snoring away. And the second Pollock decides to play a little prank on him. So he guts the deer, which I know doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would you gut it where you shot it? Why would you bring it back to camp to gut it? But that's what he did, okay? And then he decides to push all those guts under a sleeping friend, which somehow doesn't wake him up, which makes even less sense. It's not really a prank at this point. It's just really nasty and disturbing, but that's how the joke went. So he pushes his guts under a sleeping friend, doesn't wake up. And then he goes back to hunt, because apparently they were poachers. And then they decided to get more than one deer apiece. He comes back a few hours later, near sunset, finds the first Pollock sitting on a log around a fire he'd made. Big grin on his face. And that first Pollock, who was sick, says, "Oh, man, you would not believe what happened when you were gone. Turns out I was a lot sicker than I thought. I laid down to take a nap, and then when I woke up, I realized I'd shit out all my guts. And then with the help of this trusty stick, I got them all back in. And that's it. That's the whole joke, get it? You shoved a whole bunch of deer guts up his ass with a stick. Why would he think that was okay to do? Because he's Polish. Because because it's a stereotype. Is cancel culture going to now turn on me for retelling this old Pollock joke? His friend didn't mind. Mike Kaczynski just shook his head and said, "Oh, Ward." Maybe not the best joke, but it made Mike and Papa Ward laugh. It made me laugh as a kid too. Made me laugh when I thought back on it. Wrote it into my notes. Papa Ward loved a good joke. He worked real hard, but he never took life too seriously. Around that same time, I also made my grandpa laugh harder than I'd ever seen him laugh before. I liked to watch cartoons as a kid. Of course I did. I was a kid. When the school bus dropped me off in front of Papa Ward and Grandma Betty's house after school in like 3rd grade, all the way through 8th grade, my routine was I would grab a snack, almost always Ritz crackers, cheese, and I would lay in front of the TV and watch some cartoons. And one of them was Looney Tunes. And Tom the cat, one cartoon, he's chasing Jerry the mouse. Well, he steps on a rake, and it pops up and it flattens his face. And I thought, I wonder if a rake would really do that. Would it really pop up like that? So then late one afternoon, I tried to play a dirty trick on a neighbor kid named Levi. I don't remember a lot about Levi. He only lived nearby for maybe half a year. The main thing I remember about him is he ate his own boogers. And I know because he told me. He showed me one day. He was like, you can eat boogers. I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, watch. And he picked a booger out of his nose and he ate it. And I just thought, I probably should never high-five this kid again. We're probably not going to be real good friends. And we weren't. But this one day, I invited him over. I'd hidden a rake, some tall grass in the shade, around the back of Grandpa's house. And I talked him into racing me 10 laps or something around the house, just some nonsense kid shit. And each lap, I would try to steer him into stepping on that rake. And he never did. And then that booger eater wised up, and he realized what was happening, and he got mad, and he stomped off, went home. So now I still didn't know if a rake would pop up and smack you in the face like he did on that cartoon. So now I laid that rake out in the backyard, out in the sun, and I started stepping on it, cautiously at first, with one arm raised to catch it should it pop up. But it didn't budge, didn't pop up. I thought I had a bum rake. I started getting frustrated, so I started stepping on it harder. Still nothing. I get really frustrated. Pretty soon, I jump up in the air, stomp down on the rake with both feet, forget to put my hands up. And that son of a bitch hit me in the fucking head so hard, it flattened me out of my back, like cartoonishly. Like arms out, almost knocked me unconscious. I was seeing stars, and a lump formed on my forehead almost instantly, right? I ran in the house crying, told my grandpa what had happened. And he was like, you what? And I told him again, and then he just laughed the hardest I had ever seen a grown man laugh. Oh my God. My grandma gave me some ice, put on my head, and life went on. Papa Ward, not one to feel sorry for you if you did something stupid like that, or if you fell down. My first instinct when somebody falls down is to laugh. Grandpa's first instinct was just to shake his head and be disgusted with you, like be mad at you for hurting yourself. That was the exception to the rule, I guess, the rake. I'm not known now as a big nurturer in the family. Like if you have a legit reason to cry, something related to some big emotional event, okay, I get it. But most of the time I'm just annoyed. I'm more of a suck it up than a cry it out type of person. I get that from Papa Ward. This is a story my sister decided to share with me, to share on this suck about Papa Ward, one of her favorite stories, illustrating this. Grandpa Ward and Grandma Betty, they would drive out into the mountains all the time when they were married. They would still do that well into his 80s to go get wood for his wood stove. He'd go cut down a tree with a chainsaw, chop it up and carry it in the truck. He's doing this in his 80s. So he and Grams are out in the middle of nowhere, up the Salmon River. She's down at the base of the hill by the truck. He's up way above the road. He hollers down for her to toss him the oil can for his chainsaw. And Graham's not known to have a good arm. My sister and her play on the same cornhole team for little family get-togethers, and they are fucking ridiculously bad. Like, they're like, how is it even possible to be that bad? How can you not throw a thing even 10 feet in front of you? My sister has the upper body strength of a normal person who has just had both of their arms like severely broken. I'm pretty sure she's never been able to do literally one push-up in her whole life. And she gets that from my Grandma Betty. Neither winning any arm wrestling tournaments anytime soon. And this day, Grandma tries to throw that oil can up the hill to Papa Ward. He's up the mountain away, so she plants her feet, winds up, flings it with all her might, and it goes up behind her. And that makes her laugh. He's not amused. He's just staring at her deadpan, annoyed. So she grabs it again. Now she's laughing. Tells her not to worry. She's going to get it this time. She winds up. This is a woman in her late 70s. Goes to throw it. Somehow flings the can further behind her and flings herself back on the ground. And now she's laughing so hard she has tears running down her face. He doesn't even crack a smile. She eventually gets up, goes to grab the oil. She doesn't come to check on her. Doesn't make sure she's okay. She grabs the oil can. They brings it up the hill to him. And then they, make it home with their wood haul a little bit later. Later, Grandma is telling this story to Donna, and Grandma's laughing so hard she can barely get the words out. Tears in her eyes again. Donna is also cry laughing. They're both dying. Papa Ward's in the recliner, sitting next to them listening, still can't see the humor in it. He finally mutters, totally disgusted, well, grown-ass woman, can't even throw a can. And he gets up and wanders off into the kitchen. And then that made Donna and Graham laugh even harder. They were like almost on the floor again. He just shook his head in his disgust and just left the house for a little bit. He didn't think that was funny, but he did have a sense of humor. He liked a good practical joke. The best one he ever pulled that I know of by far went down around 1985, 1986 when he was 8 or 9. He was 43, 44 years old. He's about my age now. He had little rental homes in Riggins. On one spring day, after one of his tenants moves out, he finds a marijuana plant in the guy's bedroom, or as Grandpa would call it, some wacky tobacco. And he decides to use this wacky tobacco to mess with his friend and neighbor who lived 2 houses down the street, Buckhorn Lawrence. Buckhorn was a character, as you might imagine, based on a guy being called Buckhorn. Not sure what his real name is. Everyone just knew him as Buckhorn. And you if you forgot his name, it was easy to remember it because you could just look at his belt buckle and it would say Buckhorn on it. He always wore blue jeans, cowboy boots, big ass belt buckle, some kind of Western shirt, cowboy hat off him. Drove a logging truck for Robinson Logging. Like a lot of people around Riggins where I grew up, for whatever reason, he despised hippies. And wacky tobacco, he thought that was a hippie drug, so he hated it. One thing he didn't hate was his vegetable garden. He grew like my grandpa did, like corns, potatoes and stuff, tomatoes. And in some hidden part of the garden, Grandpa Ward planted that marijuana plant. And he assumed Buckhorn would soon find it and be a little bit annoyed, but not too annoyed. Well, he didn't. That plant grew all summer. Papa Ward later said he was going to tell him about it, but then it was too big. It was huge. And he was afraid it was really going to piss him off. So then it just keeps growing. And Papa Ward started to get a little nervous for Buckhorn. Since growing weed in Idaho, it's still illegal, but it was like more illegal then. This is during like the Nancy Reagan War on Drugs, Idaho era. And an Idaho County Sheriff's deputy lived across the street from Buckhorn. Despite all that, Papa Ward at the end ended up taking the joke even further. He bought a bumper sticker that said, a friend with weed is a friend indeed. And he slapped that on the back of Buckhorn's big dually GMC Sierra or Ford F-350 or whatever truck. And Buckhorn drove around town with that bumper sticker. A friend with weed is a friend indeed for over a week. And then one day, this is like one of my favorite memories from childhood. It's so crystal clear in my head. I was laying down in the living room in front of the TV watching those cartoons. Grandpa's watching, stuff with me. Before dinner, sitting in the recliner. All of a sudden, I hear this booming voice yelling from down the street, Ward! Ward! God damn it, we need to talk! Ward, get out here! My grandpa perks up out of the recliner and he goes, Danny, get up and lock the door. And so I did. I don't know what the hell is going on. I'm kind of afraid. And then as Buckhorn is storming up the driveway to the front door, Grandpa yells at me, and close the curtains. So I run over, I close the curtains as this angry, red-faced, giant belt-buckled cowboy logger dude storms up and then starts pounding on the front door. My grandpa is nervous laughing as Buckhorn is just still yelling, Ward, I know you're in there. Then after maybe 30 seconds, Buckhorn gives up, walks back home. I ask Grandpa, what the hell is going on? Like, again, I'm scared. And he tells me the story. I thought it was so funny then. And I think it's funnier now. He told me that he would go talk to Buckhorn after he'd had time to calm down for a few days. And he did. And eventually they went back to being buds. Pop Ward, man. He made life fun. He loved to joke and tease and get a rise out of people. He loved to say something crazy, then turn to me and wink and laugh so hard at himself. Man, laughter. Not taking life so damn seriously. Man, it's so healthy, right? There's a lot of tense, outrage culture web trolls out there right now. And they could use some Papa Ward. Right? Maybe, pull that big, unnecessary indignation, easily offended stick out of their asses. Around this time, in addition to helping mold my sense of humor, Papa Ward also helped mold my work ethic. Who knows what I wanted at the time when I was a kid? Like comic books from the grocery store, toys, video games, something. I wanted to buy people presents on their birthdays, my own money, Christmas presents, whatever. I could be a pretty sweet kid. And Grandpa gave me a job to make money so I could do that. Grandpa first paid me to trim a hedge in the front yard with some old school, giant scissor-looking hedge clippers. Take me forever to do it, but I felt proud of myself when it was done. I got a couple bucks. Then he gave me $5 to mow and weed eat the lawn. When I had to pick some of the weeds by hand, and then when I wanted to make more money, he had me talk to a variety of neighbors in the neighborhood, ask if I could mow their yards. Some gave me $5, some a little less, some a little more. Pretty soon I was mowing, 4, 5, 6 yards a week, making some money. Grandma Betty got me a bank book, taught me how to make deposits, how to save, how to spend, right? Make sure I could save up for what I wanted. So simple. Them doing this, but so valuable. Like if no one ever teaches you about money, like working money as a kid, How are you supposed to be responsible with it as an adult? Grandpa kept working with Mike Kaczynski until the mid-90s when he was in his mid-60s. Then he retired, started tending to his rental properties more, tending to his vegetable garden more. In the mid-90s, he moved into the house that Grandma Betty lives in now, that one she grew up in. He helped take care of his mother-in-law for the final 10-plus years of her life. Grandma Stella, she could be cranky as hell. And he never complained. Not that I heard. He did sometimes pinch her butt when I was around. And then he would laugh and wink at me after she turned and hit him and cursed him in Norwegian. And she would laugh too and tell him that he was crazy. Inappropriateness is definitely in my genes. We're a big butt-slapping, butt-pinching family. Papa Ward and Grandma Betty gave each of their grandkids some money for college over the next several years. I would have never studied abroad for a semester without them. They bought each of their daughters new cars, some Subaru Outbacks 3 times over the years. They drove to Jackpot, Nevada several times a year to play the slots at Cactus Pete's. When a tribal casino opened near Lewis, Idaho, they drove there a few times a year. When they added a tribal casino at Worley, about a half hour south of Suck Dungeon, a little over 10 years ago, they started driving there. And his grandkids who wanted to come along and hang out with them, or any grandkids who wanted to come along and hang out with them, we would get to have our own hotel room to sleep in, some cash to play with, so we could sit next to them, play the penny slots. They loved it. When Grandpa would hit a $500 jackpot, it was like he won fucking $10 million. He'd be so happy. He'd be grinning for hours. If he was on a losing streak, if he's a couple $100 down, well, then they were going home early. And he would complain for weeks about how they tightened up the machines, they were cheating, and he was never going to go back. And then he would go back. He never got tired of trying to beat the casinos. He also never gambled more than he could afford to lose. And they were always quick to point that out, right? They had a set amount of money. When that was gone, it was gone. That they were going to gamble with that weekend or whatever. He sat near his Grandma Betty. They would play together like the 2 kids who'd been married over 60 years earlier. Grandpa having a beer, Grandma having an amaretto and Coke. They'd laugh, enjoy each other's company like they'd done, after those first dates, after they met at Somerville's. He wasn't always annoyed with her for not being able to throw a can up the hill of oil. They'd hold hands when they'd walk back to their room. Then they'd cuddle up in bed. I don't know how Grandma slept around him. That dude would snore loud enough to wake up the entire neighborhood. And then this past summer, out working in the yard like he'd done thousands of times before, he suddenly fell down and lost consciousness. Came to, had to be helped to the house. It seems that he probably had a minor heart attack, maybe a stroke. We never found out for certain, but he was never the same after that. He lived a really good, healthy life right up until that. Very lucky. And then he had to try and jump through some hoops because of COVID to get more doctor's appointments. It was a huge, crazy pain in the ass. Went on for months. His legs kept growing weaker and weaker until he could barely walk. Our family rallied around him, took a lot of trips to Riggins last year to help him with the yard work, which he hated. He hated seeing others do his work defined so much of him. Doctors finally found out that his heart wasn't pumping near the amount of blood it was supposed to around his body. Had some clogged arteries. Turned out he had been born with a heart defect, and he had powered past it and outworked almost everyone around him, despite that, for about 88 years. Now he needed 3 different heart valve procedures to get his legs working again and also have some arteries, cleaned up to get his mobility back. He was ready for all that. He wanted that. He wanted the operations, no fear. But then a few months before he passed, they found cancer in his lungs. And then it was game over. They couldn't operate. Doctors gave him maybe a year or longer to live, but Grandpa had other plans. Once he found out he couldn't get surgery, he was pretty much done. I remember my great-grandma being the same way in my family. Once, her health started to go a little bit, she'd been alone. I remember telling her one time, she was like 95. I'm like, gotta make it to 100. And she literally said, she goes, why? She goes, my friends are dead. My husband's dead. Every morning I wake up and I'm like, why am I still here? I know that is kind of dark, but also I'm like, yeah, it's kind of best case scenario to make it to that point. Grandpa, once he found out he couldn't be operating, he didn't want to be around anymore. He told me once, a couple months before he passed, he goes, Danny, this is no way to live. I'm ready to go. When I asked him once how he was doing near the end, he just laughed and goes, not good. I'm dying. Last time I saw him this past November, he had a hard time standing up. It embarrassed him. He was weak. It was hard to see. He'd always been so strong. He pulled me in close for a hug. Last time I hugged him, last time I talked to him in person, he said, enjoy your life. Man, how powerful is that, right? He's thinking about me living as he's dying. Whew. Wow. Thought I was going to make it through this one. Everyone listening, you should try and do the same, right? Live while you have life, Best case scenario, one day you'll be where he was at just a few months ago. The Reaper doesn't take days off. Right? He's always waiting. So while the sun still shines on you, right? Whenever you can get a little moment of happiness, you fucking take it, steal it, while you can still suck air into your lungs. Enjoy your life, Meat Sacks. That's what Papa Ward would say to you. Enjoy your life. Whatever hand you're dealt with, deal with it. Work with it. Because it's the only hand you got.
Good job, soldier. You made it back. Barely.
And once again, I thought this was going to be a short episode this week. But I just can't help myself, apparently. The more I thought about Papa Ward, the more stories just kept floating up. This could have been a 6-hour episode. I could have talked about how much he enjoyed sharing food with his family, right? How he loved pickling cucumbers. He grew those in his garden too. Bottling fruit, drying fruit, I guess is what you call it. Dehydrating it maybe. Making jams and jellies. He grew pears, plums, peaches, nectarines. He loved canning peaches and pears. Man, Papa Ward's peaches and his pears were delicious. Kyler Monroe loved them when they were little. He loved playing a game of rummy, game of Yahtzee with the family around the table. Oh, man, if he was winning, same big-ass grin like he was winning the casino. If Grandma was beating him, he would half joke that she was cheating. He seemed actually convinced that she must be cheating to beat him. He loved building these little stone churches that he would give to everybody. Oh, we got several of them at the house right now. Funny how he wasn't religious, but he built these little stone Christian churches, bought little figurines to kind of decorate them with, to create these little scenes. He got way into that for years. Loved going on a long walk and loved telling you that he could outwalk you. He'd still do that when he's in his 80s. All right, how you doing? I'm fine. He'd say, I'm good. I could walk, a couple more miles. He hated laziness. Hated people who are mean to their kids, are not there for them. I think you know why. He loved a good nap in his recliner. Man, he could fall asleep so fast. He could be talking one moment and then just sound asleep the next. When I asked him how he could take a nap so easily, he once said, "It's easy to sleep when you got a clean conscience." More good advice. He loved music. He didn't listen to music a lot, but he did love it. He loved going to old-time fiddlers, kind of little get-togethers that would swing through town sometimes. Fats Domino was his favorite. Blueberry Hill seemed to be his favorite song. He also loved Willie Nelson. I loved to watch the Atlanta Braves play baseball, the Boise State University Broncos play football. I like to watch the news, like to shake his head at the state of the world outside of Riggins. And before I wrap up this suck of his life, my sister Donna has another story about Pop Ward she'd like to share to show who he is. She said, when she was little, my sister loved Pop Ward and Grandma Betty's house just like I did. After he moved to Riggins, moved out of their house into a house just across the road from them, one they owned, they really became extra parents to us both. Donna used to get confused, accidentally called Grandma Betty Mom. We were there so often, I'm sure our mom loved that. Donna would sit on his lap when she was little, flip his comb over his head. God, he had a comb over for so many years. It would dangle down the right side of his face, and then she would braid his hair. I did that too. He was very tolerant of all that. He loved to have both of us on his lap. He would give Donna the occasional sip of Keystone Light. If Donna had an extra bad day in kindergarten or first grade, she would head to Papa's house, tell him about it first before Mom got home from working in the grocery store. Like when she got in trouble for grabbing boys by their shirts and spinning them around as fast as she could, flinging them across the grass because they made her mad at recess. And then he would tell her not to worry about it, not let those boys be mean. Then he would send her across the road to go play with her best buddy, Leah Catherman. And then they had a system. She would go play. And then when Mom came home, he would stop over at Grandpa's house first. And then he would smooth things over with Mom and make her swear that Donna wouldn't get in trouble. And then Donna would call the house to make sure the coast was clear. And then she would come home to Papa's house. For our mom, it was infuriating. But as a kid, it was pure gold. After her first year away in college, Donna came back home, lived in Grandma and Papa's bunkhouse where Grandpa Frank lived at one point. Great-Grandpa Frank, my God, over summer break. She was working construction with our dad, but she wasn't really built for it. You heard about her upper body strength. She came home after the first day of hard labor, battling young boys at the job site, completely covered in paint. She'd been painting ceilings, working as labor all day, and she was near tears. She was so sore. Papa knew that. He didn't have to be told that her pride was on the line or that it mattered. He barely chuckled when she got home, led her by the hand to the shed out back, scrubbed her down with turpentine. No words were exchanged, right? They didn't talk. She tried not to cry at her frustration. They laughed a little, and then he handed her a Keystone Light. He was good that way. He knew what it was like to be the underdog, to hold your pride together, the value of hard work. Wasn't something to be mocked, something to be quietly respected. Also knew the value of an ice-cold, shit-cheap beer on a hot summer day. He kept the fridge stocked for the rest of the summer. She still drinks Keystone Light on occasion, but it has to be a wicked hot day after a hard day's work outside. So thanks for sharing that, Donna. Papa Ward used to tell me, "You're a good man, Charlie Brown." If so, I learned from one of the best. I was talking the other day with Joe and Zach here, the Reverend Doctor, script keeper here in the Suck Dungeon, about parenting, about what makes a good parent. And we arrived at this point about how a lot of it boils down to respect. I mean, not always, of course. There's going to be aberrations. Some kids have developmental, situations, behavioral problems. But for a lot of kids, it boils down to respect. And if you don't live a respectable life, why should your kids respect you? They're not going to listen to you as much if they don't respect you. That old adage, do as I say, not as I do. Always thought that was bullshit, because it is. Grandpa never had to get after me. When I was around him, I always towed the line he set. Far worse than a spanking or a grounding from my parents was a disgusted look of disapproval from Papa Ward. That shit killed me because I respected him so much, right? It meant so much to have him respect me. I told him as much a year ago. Lindsay encouraged me to tell Papa Ward and Grandma Betty how much they meant to me before it was too late. I'm so glad I did. They told my mom later, about made them cry. So tell your Papa Ward and Grandma Betty's, if you got them, tell them how much they matter to you or the other people in your life, right? You never know when it's going to change. So hail Papa Ward. May Nimrod set you on some kind of cosmic throne. May Lucifina comfort you until Grandma Betty joins you. Bojangles, be extra good. He can't stand a disobedient dog. And Triple M, take a set break. We love you, but he prefers Fats Domino and some Blueberry Hill. Time for today's top 5 takeaways.
Timesuck Top 5 Takeaways.
Number 1, 1894. That's when Nashville's Samuel Hall got his homestead land title for 160 acres near and now partially under Cascade Lake. About 3 decades after that first white man, Packer Johnny, wandered through Valley County's Long Valley. Number 2, May 22nd, 1960. That's when my aunt was born in the passenger seat of a 1950 Plymouth coupe on the side of the road between New Meadows and Council. Papa Ward helped deliver her. Grandma Betty had to then turn the key as she held her baby born just a few minutes earlier while Papa Ward pushed the car through the snow to help start it. Number 3, Papa Ward's dad, my great-grandpa Charlie, was a colossal asshole and a selfish drunk. Fuck him. Number 4, lead by example. You want others around you to raise their game, raise your own game first. You can't command respect if you're not respectable. I feel like that's straight from Papa Ward. Number 5, new info. Jamie Jean and Elliot Davis, 2 awesome dudes living out in Nashville, have been filming a documentary on Timesuck, filming footage for a couple years now. At some point, it will be released. We have no idea when. But they interviewed Papa Ward and Grandma Betty to see what they thought about me a little over a year before he passed. So meet the man, the myth, the legend. Here are a few minutes from the 2 most influential people in my life.
We've had a very good relations with our grandkids.
Yeah.
Especially with Danny. We always called him a motor mouth when he was younger.
Okay.
That's all he did was talk, yeah.
You couldn't shut him up.
Easy.
Must have got it from his mother. We'll blame her anyway.
He lived down the street.
Down the street from
His
us there
mom
in Reagan's.
Yeah.
I used to call him the absent-minded professor. He would come up and get a house key, forget to bring it home. I don't know how many we made.
Probably
Ward
10.
and Betty raised Dad. I mean, they were just so much a part of his everyday life. Breakfast at their house, lunch at their house, dinner at their house, just like...
I basically raised him there for both of them, him and his daughter, or sister too,
Right.
for about 3 years.
We just treat him like anybody else,
We don't think of him as
We don't
some
think
kind
of him as
a celebrity.
No, as somebody on
He's just a
stage.
damn grandkid.
Danny's high school graduation.
Yeah.
That was, when they walked down the aisle, he was a salutatorian. And my mother, when she was sitting by me, and I never noticed because they were walking with the gowns, and she said, "Look at Danny. He doesn't have any shoes on." They had their gowns on.
And shorts.
And they had their boxer shorts on.
And then
And
flushed
they
everybody.
Reagan's had never seen anything like that before.
I was a weirdo.
You want to ask him
Yeah.
about it.
So what's the first that you hear of him doing comedy?
Well, I was kind of worried about it because, there had to be some rough spots. And I still worry about him, all that flying and everything, I don't know. You just can't help but worry about him a little bit. I know he's all right, but he's still there.
We haven't seen too much.
We went, up to Spokane
I love this.
twice. And then to Boise once and seen him on set, and then some of the language he uses. Yeah, we're not used to that. Of course, it don't bother me, but enough's enough.
I told him one time, Danny, you can be funny without using that F word.
The way he said.
He said, I like to say it. He's made a good living, so we appreciate that.
And we support him for what he does.
And he's very much a family man. And he's very conscientious, and he's thoughtful.
Right.
He never forgets Ward's birthday or my birthday.
Too much.
These sounds are Kyler Monroe playing with Papa Ward.
Come here.
I got you now. I got you now. Come back here. Come back here. Come back here.
I still to this day don't know where those keys went. It's a mystery. It's a family mystery. I must have lost at least 10 of them. He didn't care for the profanity, but he did care for me. And me and Ryan Shaw, yes, we did flash the Townsfolk O'Regans. One of my many questionable decisions in my youth. I do like to say the F word still. I really do. Thank you everyone for listening to that. That was pretty special.
Timesuck. Top 5 takeaways.
Papa Ward has been sucked. 1932 to 2020, gone but certainly not forgotten. Thanks to the Space Lizards who voted that topic in. It really kind of forced me to look at his life in a way I honestly probably would have never done had you not voted that topic in. Just because, we get busy, you focus on work, different things. It was, special this week. Come on. All right. Thank you to the Bad Magic Productions team for all the help in making Timesuck. Queen of Bad Magic, Lindsay Cummins, Reverend Dr. Joe Paisley, the script keeper, Zach Flannery, Sophie, the Fact Sorceress Evans, Bit Elixir, Logan, the Art Warlock, Keith, running BadMagicMerch.com. Working on the socials with Liz Hernandez. And again, the new improved customer service email, store at badmagicproductions.com. Still hoping to get the Cult of the Curious private Facebook page back online. Fucking Facebook, goddamn. I've had so many fucking Facebook problems this past week. Talking with some people at Facebook. They're very nice, but they got a lot of fucking rules right now. They're very confusing. Wish we could speed things along. Now shifting gears big time. Next week, not going to be an emotional episode. For me, at least. Going to be sucking on a serial killer again. We're going to go true crime again with a little-known serial killer named Cary Stayner, a.k.a. the Yosemite Killer. You may have heard of his brother, Stephen Stayner, who was the kidnapping victim of Kenneth Parnell, a notorious pedophile who kept Stephen for 7 years captive. Such a weird convergence of stories. Meanwhile, Cary grew up in a home that was physically together but emotionally broken while his brother was away. He would receive no counseling from his parents about his missing brother. Then to make things even worse, he would later claim to have been molested by an uncle when his brother was missing, when Cary was 11. So much going on in one family. It's a crazy story. Cary's only refuge from the pain in his life was Yosemite, the park where he felt at peace. In nature, alone, he camped and hiked and seemed to find some stability, but the tragedy would continue outside of the park, with Stephen dying an early death and Cary's uncle, the one who molested him, getting murdered when Cary was living with him. Police still not sure if Cary murdered his uncle or not. Probably. He for sure murdered some other people. In the spring and summer of 1999, Cary Stayner brutally murdered 4 women, 3 women in February, who were staying at the Cedar Lodge where he worked, and 1 woman, a park worker, in June. He would sexually assault 2 of his victims, decapitate one, nearly decapitating another. In February, the FBI canvassed the area for anyone they could find who could perpetrate such a horrifying, violent crime. Cary would lurk right under their noses until June, when he would murder again. Investigators described him as seeming too nice and too normal to be a suspect. And they were wrong. The horrifyingly sad story of Stephen Stayner and the equally terrifying life of his brother, Cary Stayner, next week on Timesuck. And now let's head over to this week's Timesucker updates. Lots of interesting Elan School messages pouring in this week.
Updates? Get your Timesucker updates.
Okay, I'm keeping this first updater, this main updater, anonymous, because I don't want him to get in any more trouble at work than I've already gotten him in. He writes, "Good afternoon, Dan Kingsucker and Bojangles Bitch. I discovered Timesuck from Scared to Death. Now I can't get enough of either one. That's great, thank you. Sometimes I try to make my commute a little longer just so I can listen to more. Need to share this update, an incident with you. First, the update. I was excited to hear that you'd be sucking the Elan school. When I was in high school in the mid-90s, some of my finer teachers and one guidance counselor would use the Elan school as a threat if we didn't straighten out. Living a little more than an hour from this quote-unquote school made the threat seem more real. My father was the middle school principal and knew some of the happenings at that school, and the topic was hush-hush in his school. But in my high school, it was the last resort. We always heard that they were strict, ran a tight ship, but never heard the true horrors you described. I never knew anyone that went there, thankfully. I recently passed by the school for work, and it is an abandoned pile of shit rotting in the woods now. Good. Clearly, this guy was not from Maine. We may be backwoods up here, but we're not cruel. Now to something slightly funnier. I totally got Cummins Lod. He actually wrote Dummins Lod, not Cummins Lod, where Timesuck plays at an inopportune time, but a Timesuck reference gone horribly wrong. Have you ever used the phrase calm down, killer, or relax, killer, when someone gets worked up about a subject? At my work, we have a pretty diverse workforce. There's a guy from Bulgaria that works in the same building as me. Being an ignorant American, I put Bulgaria as part of Russia. Anyway, the Bulgarian I work with was out at the smoking area, and I walked by him as he was getting fired up about something. So I looked at him and said in my best Russian accent, calm down, Chikatilo. I thought it was funny, and I walked away snickering to myself. Later that day, I was called into HR, and I had to explain why I said what I said. Apparently, he knew of Chikatilo, and he did not find that funny. Now I have to attend a sensitivity training. I hope you find this as funny as I still do. Sorry for the short email. 3 out of 5 stars, wouldn't change a thing. Keep on sucking. Soon to be your newest space lizard and king of Dummins Law. I call myself Captain Dinkwad. Well, good luck with your sensitivity training, Captain Dinkwad. I sincerely hope you are not fired. If you do get fired, though, before leaving, you might as well just throw out, what is big deal? So I dug off in soft shamcock and corner. I bother no one. Glad to hear what was once the Elan school now lay in ruins. Now a random positive drug update that I loved hearing from Super Sucker Kyle Therio. Kyle writes, hey, Fellowship of the Suckers. I've been hearing for years now about Dan's opinion on drugs and how he wants them all to be legal. True. Well, that might be sooner than later. Washington State just passed the Pathways to Recovery Act, which will decriminalize the use of hardcore drugs like crack, cocaine, etc., putting more money into rehabilitation and also letting people be responsible for themselves if they choose to make horrible choices. But anyways, thought you'd be interested. Keep on sucking. Hail Nimrod. Yes, Kyle. Thank you for the link. Yes, the Washington State House Public Safety Committee voted 7-6 to approve the Pathways to Recovery Act, which would remove penalties for personal use amounts of illegal substances, just all of them, and expand outreach and recovery services. The vote is the first time a panel of lawmakers in any U.S. state has voted to remove criminal penalties for possession of all drugs. Well, it's about fucking time. Legalizing drug use, all drug use, will not send our culture into some depraved death spiral. I don't know why people think that. It's just a bunch of bullshit morality posturing. Not saying some drugs aren't bad. Some of them are really bad. I'm just saying that kicking people when they're down for using them is fucking stupid. It's so fucking stupid. Punish harmful crimes committed by those on drugs. Don't punish people for using the drugs. Tired of stuffy old men who I'd rather kick in the fucking nuts than have a drink with, deciding what's right and wrong for the rest of us. Now another Elan-related message. Like those Elan kids, Sweet Sucker Sean had a shit time in the system. And he writes, hello, Suckmaster and crew. Latest episode hit me hard. Without going into great detail, I spent most of my formative years in the system. It is tough feeling abandoned, blaming everyone and being victimized. Obviously. As humans, our primary responsibility is to grow our little meat sacks into safe, successful adults, yet these type of caretakers still exist. It's outrageous. It's been 20 years since I left the system. It still haunts me to this day. It has brought up some shit for me with this episode, but I want to thank you. Thank you for sharing their stories and bringing to light how children become victims and have nowhere to go and often no one to advocate for them. I hope it will cause more people to question, always be curious when it comes to the care of the children around them. I found my family in this cult. That's all that I need. You hope our minds remain open, our hearts remain in Nimrod's belly button. Sean. Thank you, Sean. I'm glad that you're out of the system. Sorry it was so fucked for you. Hope this episode helped in some way as well. In addition to the Elan School episode. Papa Ward, not in the system, but, he might have been better off had he been. I have a feeling he was abused pretty severely. And with, I imagine, a lot of effort, he worked really hard to get himself into a much better life than those who were supposed to protect gave him, who were supposed to protect him gave him. Glad we can be here for you, dude. Also, a lot of Timesuckers, since the Cult of the Curious Facebook page has shut down, have bounced over to the Scared to Death, Creeps and Peeper private Facebook page, and also the Is We Dummies Facebook page. So you can search in the Facebook search bar for both of those groups and find a lot of the people that you were talking to while we await the Facebook God's decision. Now for another Elan-related message from another meat sack, victimized as well in a too unregulated system. My God. Emma, I'm going to leave her last name out of this, writes, "Hey, Dan, I've been a huge fan of your stand-up for many years. Now Timesuck and STD. Listening to the Lawn School / Cult of Synanon Suck. It brought back many memories of when I was in a cult-like group in high school. It was a Christian ministry out of Ohio. I'm not going to say their name because I don't want to give them any more attention than they already receive. I had to sign a notarized contract stating I would not engage in sexual behavior, drink, smoke, do drugs. I would attend small groups, Bible studies multiple times a week. We put on a theater production as well. We traveled all over the country. If we broke our contract, we had to pay $2,000 in addition to the $2,000 we paid to participate. I won't elaborate too much, but there was a great deal of grooming, pedophilia, and matchmaking going on. We were kids surrounded by adults who were supposed to protect us, but instead put us in bad situations. And it was always the girls' fault, and they failed us. I blame my parents a lot for what happened to me, so I can't imagine how the students at the Elan School felt. Thank you so much for informing us on topics like this, the Suck and the Cult of the Curious. Keep me going every day. Also, if you read this, shout out to my best friend in the whole world, who I turned into a huge time sucker. I love you, Mac. M-A-K. I'm assuming it's Mac. You're the best auntie to my little girl in the whole world. And to you, Lord Suckmaster, keep on sucking. And hail Lucifina. Thank you, Emma. And hello, Mac. You both sound awesome. Sorry you were abused by the people who were supposed to protect you, by people who pretended to be God's people. Wolves hiding in the light. Worst kind of wolves. Hope their group gets exposed to the proper legal channels and shut down. Scrutinize who you let, watch your kids, meat sacks. Don't be afraid to check in on anyone. Even if they're part of some religious group that you're part of. That doesn't mean they're above scrutiny, ever. And now let's end on a positive troubled teen industry update. We have gotten some positive messages as well. It's like, kids being helped in these behavioral institutes, parents of kids, the kids themselves. This is a sweet sucker who wishes to remain anonymous. He writes, "Dear Dan Sucksworth III, first of his name, I love the podcast. Have been listening since the transgender suck. I'm currently listening to the Lawn School suck and heard you bring up wilderness therapy programs as I am someone who works for one of those organizations. I wanted to quickly give you and possibly other suckers some insight on the current state of the industry. A little background about my position and how at least my organization works. I've been a wilderness therapy guide. Think like a cross between an expedition guide and a dorm room residence hall assistant, or residence administrator, for the last 2 years, which essentially means I take groups of kids between the ages of 13 and 17 struggling with mental health issues like depression, anxiety, Asperger's, high-functioning autism, substance abuse, etc., and bring them backpacking, mountain biking, rock climbing, as well as other outdoor activities. Then once a week, the kids will meet up with their therapist, try to come up with some goals to work on for the upcoming week, as well as try to figure out solutions to problems back at home. Firstly, I do want to acknowledge that in the past, there has definitely been a bad track record when it comes to wilderness therapy, and that occasionally there are problems that still arise today. Though I'd like to point out how, just like Pennhurst and other mental health facilities back in the early days of adult mental health were horrible and abusive in the same similar ways as the Elan School was for teen mental health. Similarly, those industries have come up leaps and bounds to try to remedy and prevent those abuses and actually become successful in fulfilling their role in trying to help people's mental health. Though I do recognize that it has been a lot slower in the teen mental health realm, most likely due to the slow changing of ideas around what appropriate discipline looks like for adolescents. Like I said, though, there have been leaps and bounds in the last decade to try and prevent further abuses. For instance, the organization I work for prides itself on being a non-punitive program, meaning that there is absolutely no form of punishment. The closest thing that could be construed as punishment is a safety measure we take when one of the kids is threatening the safety of the rest of the group. If they're bullying, physically threatening. We have them do the activity that they're already going to do that week separately from the group for a week with 2 guides, while they work with their therapist on a way they can safely reintegrate to the rest of the group. Additionally, staff are not allowed to be alone with kids, always need to make sure another staff is within eyesight around the kids. Also, staff have to go through state and federal background checks, as well as guides have to go through a week-long orientation vetting process before they're officially hired and allowed to work with kids. I do believe we could definitely use more training in mental health before we start, but we attend weekly meetings on different mental health trainings, have found them useful. The kids are also allowed and encouraged to write weekly letters to their parents as well as phone calls. On top of that, while the students are in the program, the therapists work closely with the parents to figure out what the parents need to do better, since let's face it, kids who are struggling emotionally usually don't have parents who are batting 1,000. True. There are still issues, and granted, not every kid has a great experience with the program. Due to it being an outdoor program, for them not being suited for being in the outdoors for such a long time, and the issue of a lot of their parents opting to send them to the program despite the kid not wanting to go. On the flip side, though, I have seen this program do wonders for lots of kids' mental health. I've gotten multiple letters from kids saying that this program has helped them immensely, as well as seeing the change that happens to them over the weeks that they are with us. As someone who seems to enjoy nature as much as I do, you can probably agree that getting into nature can be quite healing and perspective changing, not to mention adding therapy from actual therapists. Anyways, if you made it this far, I want to thank you for reading the poor spelling and grammar I've typed. There's a reason I work in the woods now. It's fucking great. I appreciate you calling out the ugly parts of the industry. Wouldn't expect any less of you, but I wanted to just add in my perspective and try to show that wilderness therapy is not the abusive, riddled industry it once was, and that it can actually produce a lot of good. If you want to look deeper into the program I work for, it is Aspiro Wilderness Adventure. Thanks again for reading. P.S. If you do mention this in the suck, I would appreciate that you don't use my real name. Just want to make sure to cover my bases when it comes to anything HIPAA-related stuff. You can refer to me as Big Thor. Well, Big Thor, I appreciate you sending this message. I did not spend enough time pointing out what a positive experience some of these facilities can be for struggling kids. Thank you for doing that for me, and thank you for doing what you do. Yes, I do love nature. It's so good to disconnect from tech, reconnect, with how we humans have lived for the overwhelming majority of our existence. And thanks to modern clothing, tech, and hiking equipment, you can now enjoy nature in the safest way we've ever been able to enjoy it as a species. Best of both worlds. Good hike, good company, sunshine, and an incredible vista to look at, combined with some solid therapy. That does sound like a wonderful way to heal and grow. Hail Nimrod to you, sir, and to all the wonderful therapists out there, those with degrees, those without, who become Pop Awards for those who didn't get to grow up with one like me.
Thanks, time suckers. I needed that.
We all did.
Thanks for listening to this Bad Magic Productions podcast, Meat Sacks. Now go hug your grandpa and your grandma, and then pinch them on the ass, like Papa Ward used to pinch Grandma Stell. And then tell them to don't worry about the fuck word, the F word, and to keep on sucking. A friend with weed is a friend indeed. I don't know what Buckhorn was so mad about. That's a fucking great friend.